Victor Sloan didn't knock. He never knocked. He kicked open the door of the Mercer Ranch house at 7 in the morning, two of his hired men behind him, and walked straight to the kitchen table where Silas Mercer was drinking his first cup of coffee. He picked up the cup, looked at it for a moment, and set it down hard enough to slosh coffee across the worn wood. Then he leaned forward, both hands flat on the table, and said, "Sign the water rights over to me by Friday, Mercer, or I'll make sure that widow woman and her brats have nowhere left to go come winter." Silas didn't move, didn't blink. Victor straightened up, smoothed his coat, and walked back out the door he'd left open behind him. The cold morning air poured in like it owned the place. If you're watching this story for the first time, welcome. And if you've been here before, you already know we don't do quiet around here. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss what's coming next, because the stories on this channel have a way of finding people who need them. Tap the like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this one travels. Now stay with me, because this story is only getting started. The town of Garnet Creek, Wyoming Territory, had a way of remembering things longer than was useful. It remembered the drought of 1871, the bad winter of 1874, the feed store fire that took out half of Main Street 2 years after that. It remembered which families paid their debts and which ones didn't. It remembered every marriage, every funeral, every scandal that had ever given people something to talk about on slow afternoons. And more than almost anything else, it remembered Silas Mercer turning down women. There had been 12 of them, by most counts. A few people said 14. Old Hattie Bowers over at the dry goods counter swore she'd personally witnessed 15 separate rejections, though most folks suspected she was counting the same woman twice when it came to the Halverson girl, who had tried twice in 1 year. However many the actual number, the pattern was the same every time. A woman would come to call. Silas would be polite enough, in his remote and wordless way. He would listen to whatever was said, nod once or twice, and then say something along the lines of, "I appreciate you making the trip," before finding a reason to walk back toward his barn. The women never came back a second time. The ones who tried got the same result. I was 36 years old and had run the Mercer Ranch alone since his father passed 8 years prior. And in those 8 years, he had become something of a fixed point in the local landscape, like the ridge line north of town or the particular bend in Garnet Creek itself. Permanent. Reliable in a certain cold way. Not unkind, exactly, but not reachable either. His neighbors respected him. His cattle were healthy. His fences held. He paid what he owed and asked nothing in return, and showed up when there was real trouble. A range fire, a bad accident, a family that needed extra hands at haying time. But he went home alone every evening, and nobody who watched him walk back to that dark house at the end of the day could honestly say he looked like a man who was happy about it. They just didn't say that to his face. The story people told about why he was the way he was came in different versions depending on who was telling it. The most common version involved a woman named Clara, though whether she had been a sweetheart or a near fiancée shifted with the telling. What stayed consistent was that something had happened 6 or 7 years back. Something had gone wrong between Silas Mercer and a woman he'd trusted, and whatever that thing was had left him the way a hard frost leaves a field. Everything still there on the surface, but nothing growing underneath. Silas never talked about it, not to anyone. So when October came around and the whole town of Garnet Creek heard that a widow woman had rolled into town on a freight wagon with 2 children and an attitude that didn't match her circumstances, most people figured it was interesting enough to watch from a safe distance, but nobody expected anything to come of it. There had been interesting women before. There had been bold women and practical women and beautiful women and smart women, and none of them had managed to find the door in the wall Silas Mercer had built around himself. Nobody expected Evelyn Brooks to be any different. Nobody was paying close enough attention. She arrived on a Wednesday, which was the same day the weekly freight came in from Cheyenne, so at least a dozen people saw her climb down from the wagon seat with a child on each side and a trunk that she moved herself without asking for help. The boy was 12, dark-haired and serious-looking, with the kind of eyes that took in a place all at once and filed it away. The girl was 8, small and quick, and she had apparently decided somewhere between Cheyenne and Garnet Creek that the world was fundamentally interesting because she was looking at everything. The horses at the hitching post, the mud on the street, the sign over the mercantile, with the concentrated attention of someone conducting a survey. Evelyn herself was 31. She was not small. She carried herself the way a person carries themselves when they have stopped worrying about whether they take up too much space and started worrying about more practical things. Her dress had been mended at the left cuff and pressed carefully despite whatever conditions she'd traveled in, and she had a face that had clearly had some weather on it, not lined in a tired way, but in the way of someone who had been outside and working, who had squinted into sun and wind and kept going anyway. She asked at the freight office where she might find Silas Mercer's property. The man behind the counter, Pete Garland, looked up from his ledger and looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of someone deciding whether to ask a follow-up question. He must have decided against it because he just told her the road north out of town, turn at the two-peaked rock formation, can't miss the gate. "Thank you," she said, and went to collect her children. Pete Garland told the story at dinner that night. By Thursday morning, most of Garnet Creek knew a woman had come asking for the Mercer place. By Thursday afternoon, they knew she'd gone there. By Friday, people were starting to wonder. What actually happened on Thursday, in the hour before noon, was this. Silas was in the yard behind the barn, mending a section of fence rail that had split in the last wind when he heard the sound of a wagon coming up the track. He didn't look up immediately. Plenty of people came up that track. The feed supplier, the occasional neighbor, the man from the land office who came twice a year with paperwork. He finished the nail he was driving before he turned around. The wagon stopped near the gate. The woman climbed down. The boy jumped down after her and immediately began looking at the barn with the evaluating eye of someone who had worked around animals before. The girl stayed on the seat for a moment, looking at the house, and then climbed down carefully with a small cloth bag held against her chest like she was protecting something inside it. Silas set down his hammer and walked toward the gate. He was expecting something, a request maybe, or a story about a husband who'd passed and a homestead that needed help, or some arrangement someone in town had suggested. He'd heard variations of all of those before. He put his hand on the gatepost and waited. Evelyn Brooks stopped about 6 feet from him, with the directness of someone who had decided on the walk over exactly what she was going to say and had no interest in preamble. "Mr. Mercer, my name is Evelyn Brooks. I'm a widow. I have 2 children, Noah and Lily. I have some money but not enough to last the winter in town, and I have skills, cooking, preserving, mending, keeping a house running through hard weather, that a working ranch without a woman in it probably needs. I'm not here to charm you, and I'm not here to make promises I can't keep. I'm proposing an arrangement." Silas looked at her. She looked back. "What kind of arrangement?" he said. It was not quite a question. "A practical one. I manage your house and keep things running through the winter. You provide shelter and security for my children and me until spring. We assess in March whether either of us wants to continue." "That's a business arrangement," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's what I said." He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at the boy, who was still studying the barn with that careful attention, and at the girl, who had discovered one of the barn cats sitting on the fence post and was currently engaged in a very serious one-sided conversation with it. "The county's full of people who'll tell you I'm not an easy man to work for," he said. "I've been told," Evelyn said. "I've also been told you're fair and you pay what you owe." "Who told you that?" "Pete Garland at the freight office." He looked at Pete Garland at the freight office in his mind for a moment, with the particular feeling of someone who has just discovered they've been discussed. Then he looked back at Evelyn. "1-month trial," he said. "If it's not working by the end of October, you'll need to make other arrangements." "Agreed," she said. That was the whole conversation. Silas went back to his fence rail, and Evelyn went to the wagon to unload her trunk, and Noah, the boy, came over to the fence without being asked and held the post steady while Silas drove the next nail. Silas glanced at him. Noah didn't say anything. He just held the post. After a minute, Silas said, "You done ranch work before?" "Some," Noah said. "More farming than ranching." "Different," Silas said. "I figured," Noah said. They finished the fence rail without talking much, and by the time they were done, the little girl had named the barn cat Montgomery and informed her mother that Montgomery was expecting, which turned out to be true. That was the first day. The house had been running in bachelor mode for 8 years, which meant it was functional and grim. Silas had kept it clean enough in the way that a man who is organized about practical things keeps a space clean. Nothing rotting, nothing broken that impaired function, nothing left where it would cause a problem. But there was nothing warm about it. The kitchen had been operating on a rotation of about 5 meals, all of them adequate, and none of them anything you'd remember afterward. The sitting room had a chair and a lamp and no particular reason to sit in it. The back bedroom that had been a storage room since his father died still had boxes stacked in it that he'd never opened. Evelyn walked through the house on that first afternoon with the focused attention of a general assessing a fortification. She didn't say much while she walked. Noah trailed behind her, and Lily asked questions about everything. What was in this jar? Why was this hook on this wall? Could she look out this window? Was that the barn they could see from here? Lily, Noah said at one point, with the weary authority of an older sibling. Stop. She's fine, Evelyn said, without turning around. Let her look. Lily pressed her face against the cold glass of the window that looked north toward the ridge, and Silas, who happened to be passing in the hallway, caught himself stopping to watch her for a moment. This small person, entirely absorbed in the act of looking at a landscape she'd never seen before, as though it was the most interesting thing she'd encountered all week. It probably was. He kept walking. Dinner that first night was salt pork, which was what Silas had on hand, but Evelyn had found things in the root cellar he'd forgotten were there and had done something with them that made the meal considerably better than the salt pork alone would have been. Nobody said much during the meal. Lily ate with the focused intensity of a child who had been hungry, which Silas noted without comment. Noah ate quickly and offered, when he was done, to help with the dishes. You sit, Evelyn told him. You worked hard this afternoon. I want to help, Noah said. I know. You can help tomorrow. Sit down and rest. Noah sat. Silas watched this exchange with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a dynamic he hadn't seen before, and then looked back at his plate. After dinner, Evelyn asked him about the root cellar inventory and whether he'd planned to order more supplies before the snow came. He told her what he had on order. She asked 3 follow-up questions, all of them specific and practical, and when he answered the third one, she nodded and said they'd need to double the salt and add smoked fish if they could get it. Why smoked fish, he said. Because in a long winter, salt pork every day will make everyone miserable, and smoked fish lasts, and it's different enough that it matters when everything else is the same, she said. Small things matter in a hard winter. He looked at her across the table. You've been through hard winters, he said. Yes, she said, and didn't elaborate, and he had the sense that the story behind that single word was not a short one. He added smoked fish to the supply order the next morning. The first week ran like 2 separate operations sharing the same property. Silas managed the livestock and the outdoor work. Evelyn managed the house. Noah attached himself to the outdoor work with a determination that was visible even when the work was unglamorous. Mucking stalls, hauling water, learning how to mend tack by watching Silas's hands without asking him to repeat himself. Lily managed the indoors in her own way, which mostly meant moving through every room in the house and developing opinions about all of it. This chair, she informed Silas on the third day, pointing at the wooden chair by the sitting room window. This chair needs a cushion. It's too hard for sitting. It's fine for sitting, he said. It's not, she said, with the unshakable conviction of an 8-year-old who has sat in it. I sat in it for 20 minutes and my back hurt. You're 8 years old. My back still hurt. He didn't make the cushion, but he found himself 2 days later moving the chair slightly, adjusting its angle toward the window so it caught more of the afternoon light, which he told himself was for no particular reason. Evelyn noticed. She didn't say anything about it, but he caught her looking at the repositioned chair with a small, quiet expression that he couldn't entirely read, and he felt, for reasons he didn't examine, slightly caught out. The first real test came at the end of the first week, on a Sunday afternoon. He'd gone into town for supplies, his regular run, and when he came back, he found Noah on the roof of the chicken coop with a hammer and a bucket of nails, repairing a section that had started to pull away from the frame. The boy had spotted it himself, pulled the ladder from the barn, and climbed up without asking anyone whether he should. Silas stood in the yard and looked up at him. You check it was solid before you got on it, he said. Noah paused. I pushed on it first, seemed okay. That roof is older than you are. You test every section before you put your weight on it, or you go through it. Noah looked down at him, then looked at the roof section around him with new attention. Go back down the way you came, Silas said. Step where you already stepped. I'll come up. He went up himself. He could feel immediately that 2 sections were more suspect than they looked, and he worked his way methodically, testing before moving, until he'd confirmed what was safe and what wasn't. Noah watched from the ladder, taking in exactly how the testing was done. Silas could see it on his face, the way he was filing the method away. When Silas came down, he said, "Tomorrow morning, you and I will fix that roof properly. Today you stay off it." "Yes, sir," Noah said. Silas turned to put the ladder back. Then he stopped. He didn't make a habit of explaining himself, but something about the way the boy had looked at him, not defensive, not embarrassed, just listening, made him turn back. "It was good that you spotted it," he said. "The spotting was right. Just get the approach right next time, too." Noah nodded. "I will." Silas put the ladder back. That evening, Evelyn found him sharpening tools in the barn and said, without preamble, "Thank you for how you handled that." He looked up. "He's 12, she said. "He's trying to prove he can carry his weight. He doesn't always stop to think through the safe way to do it." "I noticed," Silas said. "You didn't embarrass him." "There wasn't any reason to embarrass him," Silas said. "He made a reasonable mistake." Evelyn looked at him for a moment, then she said, "Not every man would see it that way." He didn't know what to say to that, so he went back to sharpening the tool, and she went back to the house, and he spent an unnecessary amount of time on a blade that was already sharp enough. The second week, two things happened that Silas had not been prepared for. The first was that Lily learned the names of all 14 of his horses. He discovered this when he was leading one of them, a bad-tempered gray mare named for no one in particular. He'd never bothered to name them. They were working animals, out of the corral, and Lily appeared at the fence rail and said, "Where are you taking Duchess?" He stopped, looked at the horse, looked at the girl. "I haven't named this horse," he said. "Her name is Duchess," Lily said, with absolute certainty. "She has a Duchess face. You can tell." He looked at the horse's face. He was not sure what a Duchess face looked like, but the mare had a particular way of holding her head when she was annoyed, which was most of the time, that did, he supposed, have a certain quality to it. "She's not mine to name," he said, which was a strange thing to say since she very clearly was, and he knew it as he said it. "I named all of them," Lily said helpfully. "I can tell you if you want to know. The big brown one is Theodore. The spotted one is Captain. The black one with the white foot is—" "I don't need to know the names," he said, and led Duchess, because apparently that was her name now, toward the water trough. He heard Lily say quietly to herself behind him, "He knows the names. He just doesn't know that he knows them yet." He didn't look back. The second thing that happened in the second week was harder to categorize. He'd been up since 4 in the morning dealing with a heifer that was having trouble, and by the time he came in at 6, the heifer was fine, and he was covered in a quantity of barn that he preferred not to think about. He'd been planning to go directly upstairs and clean up before anyone else was awake, but when he came through the back door, Evelyn was already in the kitchen. The stove was lit. There was coffee. She looked at him. He was aware acutely of exactly what he looked like. She said, "Sit down. I'll get the coffee." "I should clean up first." "The coffee won't keep," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She put the coffee in front of him. He wrapped both hands around it and looked at it and felt, in a way that was completely disproportionate to the circumstances, something loosen in his chest. "Heifer?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Both all right?" "Both all right," he said. She moved to the stove to check something, and he drank his coffee, and neither of them said anything else for several minutes. And the silence was a different kind of silence than the one he usually sat in at that table. He noticed this. He didn't say anything about it. He also, that morning, without quite deciding to do it, brought in a better cut of beef from the cold store, the kind he usually saved for when he had company, which was almost never, and left it on the kitchen table before he went upstairs to clean up. When he came back down, it was already in the pot. Lily said at dinner, "This is the best thing I've ever eaten in my entire life." Noah said, "You said that last Tuesday, about the cornbread." "This is better than the cornbread," Lily said. "This is the best." Evelyn said, "It's good beef. Good beef doesn't need much." Silas said nothing, but he thought, "I should do that more often." He did not ask himself why. The third week, Silas Mercer began to have a problem he had not anticipated. The problem was not that the arrangement wasn't working. It was that it was working too well, in ways that extended past the practical and into territory he hadn't agreed to enter. He had told himself, and believed, that this was a business arrangement. He had a woman running his house, and a boy learning his land, and a small girl who had apparently renamed all his horses. And the house was warmer in the literal and figurative sense than it had been in years. And none of this was supposed to matter to him personally. It was supposed to be a trial, a practical decision. But the practical decision had started doing things he hadn't budgeted for. Like the afternoon, Lily fell and scraped her knee badly on the rock outcropping by the barn, and the sound she made, not a big cry, just a small surprised one, quickly bitten back, brought Silas out of the barn at a pace that surprised him, and he found himself kneeling on the cold ground looking at a child's scraped knee with the same focused urgency he'd have brought to a fence in a flood. He cleaned it, he bandaged it. He told her she'd been tough about it, which was true. She'd looked up at him with wet eyes and said, "It hurt a lot." And he'd said, "I know it did." And she'd leaned her head briefly against his arm, and he'd gone very still, the way a person goes still when something unexpected touches them. He'd gone back to work afterward. He hadn't said anything about it to anyone, or like the night he was in the sitting room, late, trying to work through the ranch accounts, and he heard voices from the children's room. Evelyn putting them to bed, the sound of Noah's lower voice and Lily's quicker one, and then Evelyn's voice, reading. He couldn't make out the words from the hallway, just the cadence of it. He'd sat with his accounts open in his lap and listened to that sound, and realized he couldn't remember the last time a house he was in had sounded like that, like there were people in it who were being taken care of. He'd gone back to his accounts. He'd gotten nothing done. The town noticed, of course. He went into Garnet Creek for supplies in the third week, and Pete Garland at the freight office said, with a careful casualness that fooled no one, "How's things out at the Mercer place?" "Fine," Silas said. "I heard the widow's got quite a setup going out there." "She runs the house," Silas said. "That's the arrangement." Sure, Pete said, counting out change with exaggerated attention. "The boy's working out." "He works hard," Silas said. "And the little girl?" "She named all my horses." Pete looked up. There was a particular quality to his expression that Silas recognized as the expression of a man storing something to tell his wife later. "Did she?" Pete said. "Apparently," Silas said. He picked up his supplies and left before Pete could ask anything else. In the hardware store, he ran into Tom Reeves, who farmed the valley 2 miles south and had known Silas for 15 years. Tom asked about the cattle. He asked about the fence line along the north pasture. Then, with the directness of a man who has earned the right to ask, he said, "You planning to let that arrangement run past the month?" Silas looked at him. "Haven't decided," he said. Tom looked at him for a moment. "She seems like a good woman," he said. "She is," Silas said. And then, because Tom wouldn't press further and because it was Tom, he said, "She's not what I expected." Tom nodded. He didn't ask what Silas had expected. "Hard to know what to do when something isn't what you expected," Tom said. "Yes," Silas said. "Usually that's a good problem to have, though," Tom said. Silas didn't answer, but he thought about it the whole ride home. The last thing that happened in the third week, the thing that should have stayed purely practical but didn't, was the letter. He found it on the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning, not addressed to him, clearly having arrived in the previous day's post. He wouldn't have looked at it at all, except that it was lying face up, and the return address on the envelope was a law office in Cheyenne. And law offices in Cheyenne were not something a man with a ranch and a water dispute could ignore even by accident. He didn't read the letter, but he picked it up and set it more squarely on the table so it wouldn't get lost. And then he stood in the kitchen for a moment thinking about what a law office in Cheyenne might mean. When Evelyn came in, she saw the letter and went quiet in a specific way. Not surprised, but bracing. "Bad news?" he said. She picked up the letter. She turned it over in her hands without opening it, and then she looked at him, and there was something in her face that was careful and tired in equal parts. "It'll be about the land," she said. "My husband owned property in Cheyenne. There are complications. There were complications when he died, and there are still complications." "What kind of complications?" he said. She set the letter down. "The kind that cost money to fight and go away slowly if you fight them right," she said. "I'm handling it." "On your own?" "I've been handling it on my own for 2 years," she said. There was no particular heat in it, just a fact. Silas looked at her. He said, "You don't have to handle everything on your own here." She looked back at him. The careful, tired thing in her face shifted slightly. "I know," she said. And then, after a moment, "Thank you." She opened the letter. He went back to work. But when he came in at noon, he found she'd made the cornbread that Lily claimed was the best in her life. And there was fresh coffee, and she was sitting at the table doing figures in a small notebook with the focused attention of a woman doing arithmetic. She needs to get exactly right. He poured his own coffee and sat down across from her and didn't say anything. And she didn't look up, and they sat in the kitchen with the fire going and the cold pressing in outside the windows. And it was, Silas thought, almost exactly what a home was supposed to feel like. He told himself it was just the warmth from the stove. He knew, even as he thought it, that was not what it was. The end of the third week brought the first hard frost. Not the season's worst, but a reminder that the season's worst was coming. Silas spent 2 days making sure the water lines were clear and the livestock had what they needed for a cold snap. And Noah worked beside him with a competence that had grown noticeably in 3 weeks, making fewer rookie mistakes, asking better questions. On the last evening of October, Silas was sitting on the porch after dark, a habit he'd had for years, taking in the quiet before sleep, when he heard the door open and Evelyn came out and stood beside him. Not close, just near. The stars were very clear. The temperature was dropping. She said after a while, "The month's up tomorrow." "I know," he said. They stood in the cold air. "I'd like to continue the arrangement," she said, "if you're still willing." He looked out at the ridgeline in the dark. "I'm willing," he said. There was a pause. "It might get harder before it gets easier," she said. "The winter." "It usually does," he said. Another pause. The wind moved through the grass in the dark pasture. "Silas," she said. It was the first time she'd used his first name without his last. He looked at her. "Whatever the right thing to do here is," she said carefully, "I need you to know that I'm not going to pretend it's something it isn't. I don't do that. Not anymore." He understood what she was saying. He wasn't sure he knew how to respond to it. "I'm not asking you to," he said finally. She nodded. She went back inside. He stayed on the porch a while longer, in the cold, looking at the stars, listening to the sounds of a house behind him that had someone in it, that had been lived in, again, that had names on the horses and cornbread on Tuesdays, and a child who had opinions about chairs. He had a decision to make. He knew that. He just wasn't sure yet what kind of decision it was. But he stayed on the porch longer than usual, and when the cold finally drove him in, he moved through the darkened house more carefully than he usually did, quieter, so as not to wake anyone sleeping. And that small act of consideration, that involuntary instinct to protect the people inside from disturbance, told him something he wasn't quite ready to say out loud. He went to bed without saying it, but it was there. "I didn't sleep well that night." That wasn't new, exactly. He'd had bad sleepers before, nights where the ranch accounts or a sick animal or just the particular weight of silence kept him staring at the ceiling until the gray hour before dawn. But this was different. This wasn't the kind of sleeplessness that came from problems. It was the kind that came from something he couldn't name yet, something sitting in his chest like a stone that wasn't quite heavy enough to be painful but was too present to ignore. He got up at 4:30, which was earlier than necessary, and went down to the kitchen to start the stove. Evelyn was already there. She was sitting at the table with her small notebook open in front of her, the same one she'd been doing figures in the day before, and she had a cup of something, tea, not coffee. He'd noticed she drank tea in the mornings before the coffee came, and she looked up when he came in without any particular surprise. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Neither could I." He got the stove going and put the coffee on and sat down across from her without quite deciding to, which was a thing he noticed about himself lately. That he ended up at that table, across from her, without having made a conscious choice to be there. It just kept happening. "The figures," he said, nodding at the notebook. "The figures," she agreed. She looked at them for a moment, then closed the notebook. "The lawyer in Cheyenne wants $300 to continue the filing." He was quiet for a moment. $300 was not a small number. "You have it?" he said. "I have half," she said. "I'll have the other half by spring if everything holds." "And if it doesn't hold?" She looked at him across the table. The stove was ticking and clicking as it heated up, the way it did on cold mornings, and outside the windows the dark was still total. No gray in it yet, Nothing to indicate that the day was coming. Then I'll figure something else out, she said. He wanted to say something. He wasn't sure what. He poured his coffee when it was ready and drank it, and she went back to her notebook, and eventually the dark outside started to go gray at the edges, and the day came whether either of them was ready for it or not. November arrived the way it always did in that part of Wyoming. Not gradually, not with warning, but as a fact. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in 2 days and settled there, and the wind came down from the north with a consistency and a mean-spiritedness that Silas had always found almost personal, as though the weather had a specific opinion about the Mercer Ranch. He spent the first week of November making sure everything that could freeze had been protected against freezing, and everything that could break in wind had been secured against wind, and Noah worked beside him every day without being asked, learning the cold weather protocol the way he'd learned everything else, by watching first and then doing, and by not making the same mistake twice. The boy was becoming genuinely useful. That was the most honest way Silas could put it, and he was not a man who said things he didn't mean. In the beginning, Noah had been willing but raw, strong enough, attentive enough, but without the particular kind of knowledge that only came from years of working land in hard conditions. By the middle of November, something had shifted. He knew which animals needed checking first in cold weather and in what order. He knew how to test ice on the water troughs without putting his full weight on something that wouldn't hold it. He knew the particular sound a fence post made when it was about to go, and the different sound it made when it was solid. He'd learned these things because Silas had shown him, and because he'd paid attention, and Silas found himself, against every habit he'd built over 8 years of working alone, explaining things. Not just showing, explaining, telling the boy why, not just what. He didn't examine this too closely. He just kept doing it. "Why do we check the north line first?" Noah asked one morning, the second week of November, hands shoved into his coat while they walked the fence. "Wind comes from the north," Silas said. "Posts take the most pressure on the north side. They go first." "Makes sense," Noah said. And then, after a pause, "My father used to say the smart farmer checks the thing most likely to fail, not the thing easiest to reach." Silas glanced at him. "Your father farmed?" he said. "Until he couldn't," Noah said. He said it without particular inflection, just a fact, but there was something in the way he said it. The compression of a longer story into the shortest possible version of itself, that Silas recognized. He'd used that tone himself when talking about his own father. "He was sick?" Silas said. "For 2 years," Noah said. "He kept trying to work through it." "That was the problem," my mother said. "He kept trying to work through it instead of resting." He paused. "She wasn't wrong." Silas didn't say anything for a moment. They walked the fence line. "Your father sounds like he was stubborn," Silas said. "He was," Noah said, and then with a sideways look that had more in it than a 12-year-old's expression usually did, "My mother says I'm like him that way." "Is she wrong?" Silas said. Noah thought about it honestly. "Probably not," he said. They kept walking. Back at the house, meanwhile, Lily was conducting what she called an investigation of the upstairs storage room, the room that had belonged to Silas's father and still had boxes in it that Silas hadn't opened. He'd told Evelyn it was off limits, which Evelyn had relayed to Lily, which Lily had acknowledged and then apparently not fully processed, because on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of November, Silas came in from the cold to find Lily sitting on the floor of the hallway outside the storage room with an expression that suggested she had recently had a near miss. "I almost went in," she informed him. He stood in the hallway with his coat still on, looking at her. "But I didn't," she added. "Good," he said. "I wanted to, though," she said, with the moral seriousness of someone confessing a temptation they'd resisted. "There's something in there, something in a box. I could hear it." "There's nothing alive in there," he said. "Not alive," she said, "but something that wants to be found, I can tell." He looked at the closed door of the storage room for a moment. "How can you tell?" he said. Lily considered this. "It's the way the door feels," she said. "Some doors feel like they want to stay closed forever. That one doesn't. That one feels like it's been waiting." He had absolutely no idea what to say to that. He went to the kitchen and got his coffee and sat at the table and thought, for a longer time than was strictly rational, about a door that felt like it had been waiting, the thing that was in the storage room. He knew what it was. He'd known for 8 years. His father's books, his father's tools, his father's winter coat still hanging on the hook inside the door, a wooden box with his mother's things in it that had been his father's things for 30 years, and that he'd never been able to open because opening it would mean being done with something he wasn't sure he was done with. He'd been moving around that room for 8 years the way you move around a bruise, not touching it, going carefully in its direction, pretending it wasn't there while being entirely aware of exactly where it was. He was not going to be counseled on this by an 8-year-old who talked to barn cats, except that he went up to the storage room that evening after everyone was in bed, and he stood in front of the door for a while, and then he opened it and turned on the lamp and looked at what was in there. He didn't open any boxes. He just looked. He looked at his father's coat on the hook and his mother's rocking chair in the corner, and the stack of books his father had read through 3 times each, and the small wooden box on the shelf that he still wasn't ready to open. He turned off the lamp and closed the door, but he left it unlocked. He didn't tell himself why. He just did it. The week before Thanksgiving, and Thanksgiving in the Wyoming Territory in those years was a practical affair, not a ceremonial one, focused primarily on inventory and gratitude of the working kind. Silas rode into Garnet Creek for the monthly post and supplies, and came back with 3 things he hadn't expected. The first was a letter from his cousin in Denver that he hadn't been expecting and didn't particularly want. His cousin had ideas about the Mercer Ranch that Silas had been deflecting for 3 years, ideas involving selling the North Pasture or bringing in a business partner, and the letter covered this ground again with the cheerful persistence of someone who believed that the right amount of repetition eventually wore down any objection. The second was a message from the county land office, informal, handwritten, dropped in with the post, that said simply, "Victor Sloan has been asking questions about your water rights. Thought you should know." It was unsigned, but Silas recognized the handwriting. One of the clerks who'd worked the office for 15 years. A man who knew how things worked. The third was a bag of hard candy, lemon drops, the kind with the yellow wrappers, that he bought at the mercantile without quite deciding to, which he then carried home in his coat pocket and left on the kitchen table when no one was looking. He heard Lily find them about an hour later. The sound she made, not loud, just a quick, genuine intake of breath followed by an enthusiastic announcement of their existence to Noah, who was in the next room, was the kind of sound that was difficult to hear without feeling something in response to it, whether you wanted to or not. He was out in the barn, close enough to hear it through the wall. He stood there for a moment with his hand on Theodore's, the big brown horse, Duchess's stablemate, whose name he continued to deny knowing, neck, and he thought, this is what I've been missing, not the practical things, not the fence that gets mended and the meals that get made. This, a house where something small and good happens and someone is excited about it. He thought about Victor Sloan asking questions about his water rights. I thought about those 2 things together and understood, in a way he hadn't before, exactly what was at stake. He went back to work. But something in him had shifted, the way weight shifts when you change how you're carrying it. Same load, different distribution, different strain. The Thanksgiving conversation happened in pieces, the way conversations in working households usually do. Not at one table at one time, but in fragments across a day, picked up and set down between tasks. Lily started it at breakfast by asking what Thanksgiving meant on a ranch. Same as anywhere, Evelyn said. You think about what you have. What do we have? Lily asked. Evelyn looked at her daughter with the expression of a woman who could answer this question in 2 very different ways, the careful way and the honest way, and chose the honest one. More than we had in October, she said. Lily nodded, satisfied with this. Then she looked at Silas across the table and said, "What are you thankful for?" The question landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. Noah looked up from his plate. Evelyn kept her eyes on her coffee but went slightly still. Silas looked at Lily. She was looking back at him with the frank curiosity of a child who had asked a genuine question and was waiting for a genuine answer, with no awareness that it was a complicated one. "The ranch held this year," he said. "Good grass. No significant loss in the herd." Lily waited, as though this was clearly the beginning of an answer and not the whole of it. He looked at her. "The winter's going better than most," he said, which was true. And also he suspected they both knew, not the full answer. Lily seemed to accept this as the best she was going to get for now. She went back to her breakfast. After the meal, Silas and Noah went out to check the north line, and while they walked, Noah said, out of nowhere, in the manner of 12-year-olds who have been thinking about something for a while and finally just say it. My mother hasn't laughed this much in a long time. Silas kept walking. I mean, Noah said with slightly less certainty, at home, in the evenings. She laughs more. Good, Silas said. They walked. She doesn't laugh because things are funny, usually, Noah said. She laughs because she's, I don't know, easier, like she's not carrying as much. Silas stopped to check a fence post. He put his shoulder against it, tested the give, confirmed it was solid. She works hard, he said. She always works hard, Noah said. That's not it. Silas straightened up. He looked at the boy who was looking at the fence post with an expression that suggested he was not actually thinking about the fence post. What is it then? Silas said. Noah glanced at him. Something passed through the boy's expression. Not calculation, more like someone deciding how honest to be. She doesn't feel alone here, Noah said. She's been alone for 2 years. Even when she was with people, she was alone, I could tell. He paused. She doesn't feel that way here. Silas was quiet for a moment. The wind came across the north pasture and the grass moved in it. Neither do I, Silas said. It came out before he'd decided to say it, which was happening more often lately. He wasn't entirely sure how he felt about that. Noah looked at him. Something in the boy's face settled. Not surprised, more like confirmed. I know, Noah said. And he walked on ahead to the next post, and Silas followed him, and neither of them said anything else about it. That was the conversation that stayed with Silas for the rest of November. The trouble with Victor Sloan made itself known in the last week of November, not with a dramatic confrontation, that would come later, but with small things. A section of the east fence that had been solid at the last check was down, the posts pulled clean out of the ground in a pattern that didn't match wind damage. 3 of Silas's yearling cattle were missing from the south pasture, found 2 days later 3 miles down the valley on open range, apparently having walked through a gap in a fence that Silas knew had been closed. He said nothing to Evelyn about it the first time. She noticed the tight set of his jaw at dinner and said nothing in return, which was one of the things about her that he had come to it. He didn't have a word for it. Appreciate, maybe. She didn't push into things she hadn't been invited into. She waited to be told. He told her on the 3rd day, when the second fence section came down. He came in at noon and sat at the table and said, Someone's been working my fences. She put a cup of coffee in front of him and sat down. Victor Sloan, she said. It was not a question. He looked at her. You know about Sloan. Pete Garland mentioned him, she said. The last time I was in town for supplies. He said Sloan's been asking at the land office about your water rights. That the creek that runs through your north pasture is the only reliable winter water source in this part of the valley. She paused. He mentioned it the way you mention something you want someone to know without making a point of it. Silas was quiet for a moment. Pete's a careful man, he said. I noticed, she said. He drank his coffee. The kitchen was warm. From somewhere upstairs he could hear Lily's voice. She was reading out loud to herself, a habit she had that he'd initially found strange and now found oddly comforting, the way background sound becomes part of a space over time. Sloan's been after this land for 6 years, Silas said. He buys up property and controls water access and squeezes out anyone who can't compete without it. Has he tried legal means? Evelyn asked. Several times. He finds holes in property records, disputes boundary surveys, makes filings that cost money to fight. He looked at his cup. He's patient. He waits until someone is in trouble, and then he makes the trouble worse. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Does he know about us? The arrangement? The word us sat on the table between them for a moment. He knows, Silas said. He came here 3 weeks before you arrived, kicked in my door at breakfast. He said it matter-of-factly, the way you state something that was an outrage but that you've had time to categorize. Told me to sign over the water rights by Friday or face consequences. Evelyn's expression didn't change dramatically, but something in it sharpened. What did you do? I didn't sign, he said. And the consequences? Started last week, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her thinking, what? Not panicking, not recalculating whether to stay, just thinking, the way a person thinks through a problem they've decided they're going to solve. He thinks having us here makes you vulnerable, she said. He does, Silas said. Does it? He looked at her directly. No, he said. Something in her face shifted, not quite a smile, more like a confirmation. Good, she said. Then we handle it. It may get complicated, he said. Legal complications, physical ones. He has hired men. I've dealt with complicated, she said. 2 years of complicated. She picked up her cup. Tell me everything you know about his operation. I want to understand how he works. He told her. He told her about the land Sloan had accumulated over 6 years, the families he'd pushed out, the 3 cases that had gone to the county court, and the 2 that Sloan had won by filing technicalities. He told her about the water rights precedent in the territory, that whoever held documented rights to a water source had significant legal leverage over surrounding properties that depended on it. He told her about Sloan's hired men, 2 of whom had been sheriffs in other counties before taking Sloan's money, which meant they knew how to make things look like accidents. Evelyn listened to all of it. She asked specific questions. When did he first file? Who was the judge on the first case? Does he own the property outright, or does he hold debt on it? By the time he was done, he had the clear and slightly disorienting sense of talking to someone who was going to be useful in a fight. Not because she was hard or because she was reckless, but because she thought through problems without flinching away from the ugly parts of them. You've dealt with land disputes before, he said. My husband's estate, she said. The complications I mentioned. She set down her cup. Someone tried to claim his property was his father's, not his, because the deed transfer hadn't been filed correctly when his father died. It cost us 14 months and everything we had saved to prove otherwise. Did you win? We won, she said. But by the time we won, there wasn't much left to win. She said it without self-pity, just accuracy. I learned how these things work. I didn't want to, but I learned. He looked at her. All the things he hadn't known about her, the 2 years, the complications, the letter from Cheyenne, were arranging themselves in his mind into a picture that was more coherent and considerably harder than the one he'd started with. She had not come to his ranch because she was helpless. She had come because she was tactical, because she'd done the math on her options, and this one made the most sense, and she had brought herself and her children to a cold ranch in the Wyoming territory with a man known for coldness and made it work through sheer force of practical intelligence. He respected that. He respected it more than almost anything he could think of off the top of his head. You're not what I expected, he said. It came out more direct than he'd intended. She looked at him. What did you expect? He thought about it honestly. Someone who needed more help than they were offering, he said. Someone who'd used the arrangement as a way to get something without bringing much. And instead? You've brought more than you take, he said, by a significant margin. She was quiet for a moment, in the particular way she was quiet when something had landed and she was deciding what to do with it. Thank you for saying that, she said. It's just true, he said. She nodded. She looked at the table. Then she looked back up at him, and there was something in her expression, careful and open at the same time, which was a combination that took some doing, that made him think she was about to say something she'd been sitting on for a while. I need to tell you something, she said. He waited. When I came here, I told myself this was purely practical, that I was doing what made sense for the winter, and that come spring we'd assess the arrangement, and that was all. She paused. I still think that's right. I'm not trying to change the terms of what we agreed to. But, he said, but I don't want to pretend that nothing is happening here, she said. That would be dishonest, and I said I wasn't going to do that. He sat with that for a moment. What is happening here? He said. Careful. Honest. She looked at him steadily. My children are happy, she said. That's happening. Noah is learning from someone who respects him, which he hasn't had since his father. Lily has named your horses and made friends with your barn cat, and she sleeps better than she has in 2 years. She paused. And I feel like a person again, not just a problem to be solved or a widow to be managed. A person. The kitchen was quiet. The stove ticked. Upstairs, Lily read to herself in her uninterrupted way. I feel that too, he said. The being a person part. She smiled then. Just briefly, just small, but real in the way that the small ones always are. Good, she said. And then, because that was apparently where they both were, neither of them ready to say the whole thing, both of them done pretending the whole thing wasn't there, They left it at that and went back to work. December came in fast and mean. The first real blizzard hit on the 4th of the month and ran for 2 days, and when it was done, there were drifts 4 feet high against the north side of the barn, and the temperature had dropped to a place where exposed skin told you about it within 30 seconds. Silas had seen worse, but not by a lot. He and Noah spent the first day of the storm inside. There was nothing to be done outside that was worth the risk. Running the indoor maintenance that always backed up during the busy months, mending tack, checking the stored feed, inventorying the root cellar. Evelyn kept the house running with the same focused efficiency she always had, but there was an added urgency to it in the storm. She was calculating supplies, watching how fast the firewood was going, checking the water pipes twice a day to make sure nothing had frozen in the walls. She did all of this without making it feel like an emergency, which Silas recognized as a skill in itself. The ability to manage genuine danger without transmitting the panic of it to children who needed to feel safe. Lily spent the storm days reading, drawing in the small notebook she'd brought from Cheyenne, and conducting extended one-sided conversations with Montgomery the barn cat, who had taken up residence by the kitchen stove and had no complaints about the arrangement. On the second evening of the blizzard, with the wind still going hard outside and all 4 of them inside by the fire, Lily looked up from her notebook and said, "Tell a story." Noah said, "We don't need a story." "I want one," Lily said. She looked at Silas. "You tell one." Silas looked at her. He was not a man who told stories. He was a man who worked and was quiet and occasionally said things that were accurate. This was well established. "I don't tell stories," he said. "You know stories," Lily said. "You've lived here your whole life. Things must have happened." "Things happen everywhere," he said. "That doesn't mean they make good telling." "Tell a bad one then," she said. "I don't mind." Evelyn, from the chair across from him, caught his eye. There was something in her expression. Not pushing, just present, watching to see what he'd do. He looked at Lily. He told a story. Not a good one. He'd been honest about that. It was about a winter when he was 9 years old, and a family of raccoons had gotten into the grain store, and the whole effort to remove them had gone badly wrong in about 6 consecutive ways, and ended with his father standing in the yard in his long underwear at 2 in the morning, saying things that Silas would not repeat because there were children present. It was not a dramatic story. It was not a moving story. It was just a thing that had happened. Lily laughed so hard she nearly fell off her chair. Noah laughed too. Real laughter, the unguarded kind. Evelyn was smiling at him from across the fire with an expression that he could not entirely categorize, but that he thought he would remember for a long time. He told 2 more stories after that, slightly better ones, and by the 3rd one, even he had a difficult time keeping his own expression entirely straight. When they all finally went to bed, later than usual, because no one had wanted to end it, he sat alone by the dying fire for a few minutes and tried to think of the last time he'd made people laugh in this house. He couldn't remember the last time. He banked the fire and went upstairs and lay in the dark and listened to the wind and thought that if a man spent enough years being alone, he could genuinely convince himself he didn't need anything else. The convincing was the problem. It didn't mean the need went away. It just meant you got very good at not looking at it. He wasn't looking away anymore. He could feel that changing in him, and the change was equal parts terrifying and something else he didn't have a clean word for. The blizzard ended on the morning of the 6th. The world outside was white and still and brutal in the beautiful way that winter in Wyoming sometimes was, which was to say that it would kill you without hesitation while looking spectacular about it. Silas and Noah went out to assess the damage and found what he'd expected. Drifts to manage, a section of the south barn roof that had taken on more weight than was good for it and needed clearing, 1 water trough completely iced over. They worked through it methodically, the way you worked through anything, one thing at a time, in order of urgency. At noon, Silas went back to the house for coffee and found Evelyn at the table with her notebook open and a look on her face that he'd learned to read over the past weeks. The specific expression of someone who has been doing figures and has not liked the result. He poured his coffee and sat down. "Tell me," he said. She looked up. "Victor Sloan filed a challenge to your North Pasture water rights in the county court," she said. "The paperwork came yesterday in the afternoon post. I didn't tell you during the storm." He was quiet. "He's claiming that the original survey from 1868 has an error in the boundary description," she said. "If the court accepts the challenge, the water source falls outside your documented property line." "Does it have an error?" he said. I don't know, she said, but that doesn't matter right away. What matters is the filing. He can tie this up in court for months, and court costs money. Silas looked at his coffee cup. He thought about 6 years of Victor Sloan. He thought about the fence posts pulled out of frozen ground. He thought about 3 yearlings found 3 miles from where they should have been. He thought about Evelyn across this table from him in a house that was warm and alive in a way it hadn't been in 8 years. I have a lawyer in Laramie, he said. I've used him before. He knows land law. Contact him tomorrow, she said. First thing. She paused. I have some money I can put toward the legal costs. Not a lot, but no, he said. Silas. No, he said again. This is my fight. You're not putting your money into my legal costs. She looked at him steadily. If we're here, it's our fight, she said. That's how this works. The arrangement was, I know what the arrangement was, she said. I was there when we made it. She paused. I'm telling you what it is now. If Sloan wins this, where do we go? Back to town with no money and a half-resolved legal case in Cheyenne? This is not just your ranch at risk here. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them looked away. He said finally, I'll contact the lawyer tomorrow. She nodded. And we'll talk about the costs separately, he said, when I know what they are. That's all I'm asking, she said. He finished his coffee and went back out into the cold to clear snow from the south barn roof with Noah, and the whole time he worked, the two of them up there with shovels in the white Wyoming silence, the whole valley spread out below them and the ridgeline sharp and clear in the winter air. He thought about a fight he hadn't asked for and hadn't chosen and was going to have anyway. He thought about Evelyn saying, if we're here, it's our fight. He drove his shovel into the snow and cleared another load over the edge. If we're here. He'd been alone for 8 years, and in 8 years he'd never had anyone use that word to him, we, and mean it the way she meant it, not as a convenience or a formality, but as a simple statement of fact about how things actually stood between them. He worked until the roof was clear, and the cold had gotten into his fingers, and the light was going flat and gray at the edges of the afternoon. He came down the ladder and Noah came down behind him, and they stood in the yard for a moment looking at what they'd done. Good work, Silas said. You too, Noah said. They went in. The house was warm. Dinner was on the stove. Lily was telling Montgomery the cat about something that had apparently happened in her notebook, a story involving a girl and a horse and a mountain, and the cat was managing, as cats do, to look both entirely indifferent and curiously attentive. Silas hung his coat. He washed his hands. He sat down at the table. Evelyn brought the coffee without being asked. He looked up at her as she set it down, and she looked at him for just a moment, just that beat of contact, nothing performed about it. And then she went back to the stove. It was, he thought, exactly that simple and exactly that complicated, both at once, the way most things worth anything always were. The lawyer's name was Edmund Garfield, and he worked out of a narrow office on the second floor of a building in Laramie that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, and he had spent 30 years in territorial land law and had the specific kind of weariness that came from seeing the same fights happen in different counties with different names attached to them. Silas rode to Laramie on the 8th of December, the day after the blizzard cleared, in cold that made the horses unhappy and the ride long. He sat across from Garfield for 2 hours and laid out everything: the water rights, the 1868 survey, the court filing, Victor Sloan's history of acquisition through legal harassment, and Garfield listened with his hands folded on his desk and the expression of a man sorting information into categories. When Silas was done, Garfield said, "The survey issue is real, not in Sloan's favor. I'd need to look at the original documents, but from what you're describing, he's pulling at a loose thread hoping the whole seam comes apart. It's a stall tactic as much as a legal one." "How long can he stall?" Silas said. "Months. If he files responses to every motion and requests continuances, which he will, because he's done this before and he knows how, you're looking at 6 months minimum before anything gets resolved." "Cost?" Garfield named a number. Silas absorbed it. "And if I don't fight it?" Garfield looked at him. "If you don't fight it, the court accepts the challenge by default, and Sloan gets the ruling he wants. Then he owns the documented water rights to your North Creek, and you're paying him for access to water your cattle have used for 30 years. Silas was quiet for a moment. "Fight it," he said. "I'll need the original deed and the survey maps," Garfield said. Whatever you have from your father. I have them, Silas said. He'd found them 2 nights ago, in a box in the storage room he'd finally opened. He hadn't told anyone about the opening of the box. He'd done it alone, late, with the lamp turned low, going through his father's papers with the careful hands of someone handling things that had been waiting a long time to be handled. The deed was there. The survey maps were there, folded with the precision of a man who understood that some documents needed to last. He'd sat on the floor of the storage room for a while after he found them, with his father's coat still on the hook above him, not doing anything in particular. Then he'd folded the documents back up, put them in his coat pocket, and gone to bed. He gave Garfield the documents and rode back to Garnet Creek in the cold, and got home after dark to a house with lights in the windows, and the smell of something good on the stove and Noah at the barn door, waiting without being obvious about waiting, which was one of the things about the boy that Silas had come to recognize. He worried in the responsible, contained way that older children in hard circumstances learn to worry, without making the worry anyone else's problem. Everything all right? Noah said. All right, Silas said. Lawyer has what he needs. We fight it. Noah nodded. Something in his shoulders let go. They put up the horse together and went inside. Evelyn had made venison stew with the last of the root vegetables from the cellar, and there was bread. And Lily had apparently spent the day constructing an elaborate system of categorization for all the books in the house. Organized, she explained at dinner, by how interesting they were rather than by any conventional system, which placed a surveying manual from 1861 at the very top of the list because it had hand-drawn maps inside it. Maps are always interesting, she said, with the finality of someone who had considered this question thoroughly. Most people don't think surveying manuals are interesting, Noah said. Most people don't look at the maps, Lily said. Silas looked at her across the table. He thought about the survey maps in Edmund Garfield's office in Laramie, the ones his father had filed with the county in 1868, the ones that were now the center of a legal fight that was going to cost him more money than he'd planned to spend this winter. She's not wrong, he said. Noah looked at him with a slight expression of betrayal. The second week of December established a rhythm that was different from November's rhythm in ways Silas couldn't entirely account for. Part of it was the legal fight, knowing it was running in the background, that Garfield was filing responses in Laramie and Sloane's lawyers were filing counter-responses, and the whole machine of territorial law was grinding along at its own indifferent pace. Part of it was the deeper cold, which changed the texture of the days. More time inside necessarily, which meant more time in the same rooms with the same people, which had its own accumulating effect. And part of it was the storage room. He'd left it unlocked, and now he'd opened the box. And something about having done both of those things, the small act of opening a door, the larger act of going through what was behind it, had changed something in the house's atmosphere, or maybe in his own. He wasn't sure where the line was. He started moving things out of the storage room, not dramatically, not all at once, just a few things at a time when the evenings allowed it. His mother's rocking chair came out first, and he put it in the sitting room by the window, and when Lily found it the next morning, she immediately climbed into it and declared it the best chair in the house, which it probably was. His father's books came out in stages and went onto the shelves in the sitting room, and Lily reorganized the entire shelf system to incorporate them using her interest-based classification method, which resulted in the surveying manual sitting next to a novel about a sea voyage because, she explained, they both had the quality of going somewhere you'd never been. He did not explain to anyone why he was doing it. He wasn't sure he could explain it to himself, except that the room had felt like a held breath for 8 years, and he'd finally let it out, and the house felt different for it. Larger, maybe. More occupied. Evelyn noticed. Of course she noticed. She noticed everything, in the quiet, observant way that was part of who she was. She didn't ask him about it directly. But one evening she was passing through the sitting room when he was arranging the last of the books, and she stopped in the doorway and looked at the shelf and at the rocking chair and at the room that was warmer and more lived in than it had been since he was a boy, and she said, "Your mother's things?" "Some of them," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "They suit the room," she said. He looked at the shelf, at his father's books next to Lily's organizational logic. "I should have done this years ago," he said. It came out plainer than he'd intended, without the usual buffer of deflection. "Sometimes you can't do something until you can," she said. Not a consolation, just accurate. He looked at her. She was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed against the cold of the hallway, and there was something in her face that was both careful and open, which was her particular combination, the one he'd come to know the way you came to know a landscape you walked every day, not thinking about it consciously, but knowing without looking where every slope and turn was. "That's true," he said. She nodded and went back to the kitchen, and he stood in the sitting room for a moment, surrounded by his family's things and his father's books and Lily's chair and the particular quality of a room that had been reclaimed from disuse, and he thought, "I am in a different life than I was in October. Not a new one. The same one. Just opened up somehow, like a room that finally had its door unlocked." The trouble came back on a Friday. It always came on practical days, supply days, working days. Days when there was too much else to manage. Silas had noticed this about Victor Sloane's operations before. The timing was deliberate. You created problems when people were already stretched thin, when the cold and the work and the logistics of winter survival were already taking everything a man had, so that one more thing, one more fence down, one more animal gone, one more legal filing, landed when there was the least capacity to handle it cleanly. I was in the south pasture checking on a heifer that had been off her feed for 2 days when he saw the smoke. It was not the soft gray of chimney smoke. It was thick and dark, coming from the direction of the hay barn, and it was the kind of smoke that made his stomach drop before his brain had fully processed what he was seeing. He was on his horse and moving at a gallop before he'd consciously decided to go, riding hard across the frozen ground with the cold air cutting at his face and the smoke getting thicker as he got closer. The hay barn, the one that held 2/3 of his winter hay supply, was burning at the east end. It wasn't fully involved yet. The east wall was where the fire had started, working up from the base of the structure, and the hay nearest that wall had caught. But the main body of the barn still had time. Barely. He was off the horse and at the water trough, which was, in December, partly iced over, because of course it was, before he'd fully stopped moving, and he was breaking ice with his boot heel and looking for every bucket he could reach when he heard Noah's voice. "I see it!" Noah was coming from the house at a dead run, with a bucket in each hand, and behind him, and Silas's chest locked for a moment when he saw this. Lily was running too. "Lily, back to the house!" he shouted. "I can help. Back to the house, now!" Not angry. Absolute. She stopped. She looked at him across the yard. And then, in the way she always processed things, completely and without resentment, she turned and ran back. He heard the house door. She was inside. He and Noah worked the fire for 40 minutes. It was brutal work in the cold, hauling water from the trough and from the barrel on the north side of the barn, fighting the spread of the fire along the east wall while trying to keep the hay at the center of the barn wet enough to resist catching. Silas's hand stopped registering cold at some point and just registered work, which was the state you got to when there was only one thing to do and you did it with everything you had. They lost the east third of the hay. They saved the rest. When it was done, when the fire was out and the wet, charred smell of destroyed hay was hanging over the yard and both of them were standing there breathing hard in the cold, Silas did a damage assessment in his head with the automatic arithmetic of a man who had been calculating resources against needs for 30 years. 2/3 of the hay was intact. It would be tight. It might mean supplementing with feed grain from the supply store in January, which would cost money he hadn't budgeted. It would not, if the winter wasn't worse than average, mean the livestock going hungry. He looked at the burned east wall of the barn. He looked at Noah. The boy was 15 years younger than Silas and built lighter, but he'd worked that fire without flinching, without hesitating, without once stopping to assess whether he should be doing it. He was covered in smoke, and his coat sleeve had a burn on it from when the east wall had thrown a spark, and he was breathing hard and looking at the damaged barn with the set expression of someone who is angry but has it under control. "Good work," Silas said. Noah looked at him. "Someone set that fire," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Silas said. "Sloane. Or someone working for him." He looked at the base of the east wall where the fire had started. The char pattern, the specific location. No accident. "We can't prove it." Noah's jaw tightened. "We should be able to prove it." "Should and can are different things," Silas said. "Right now we clear the damage and assess what we have left." Noah looked at him. Something moved through the boy's expression, frustration, and the work of putting it where it needed to go. Okay, he said. They went to work. Evelyn had seen the smoke from the kitchen window and had spent 40 minutes doing what she could from the house, keeping Lily calm, keeping the stove going, heating water, being ready. When they came in, she looked at both of them with the quick, assessing look of someone who needs to know immediately if anyone is hurt. And when she'd confirmed they weren't, she went to the stove without a word and poured the heated water into the basin so they could wash the smoke off. Lily was at the table with her notebook, drawing with the focused intensity of a child who has been told to stay put and has found a way to make staying put bearable. When Silas came in, she looked up at him and said, "Is it out?" "It's out," he said. She looked at him for another moment. "Someone did it on purpose," she said. He looked at her. She was 8 years old. "What makes you say that?" "Because the hay barn's always wet in winter," she said. "I know because I helped Noah check the moisture in the hay last week. He said wet hay won't burn easy." She paused. "So it didn't start by accident." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "That's correct thinking," he said. Lily went back to her drawing. "I know," she said. At the table that evening, after the damage was assessed and the supply calculations revised and the horses checked and dinner eaten, Silas laid out what he knew for Evelyn, quietly and completely. The hay loss, the cost of supplementing with grain, the fire's origin, what he could prove and what he couldn't. She listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He's escalating because the legal challenge is moving slower than he wants." "Most likely," Silas said. "Which means Garfield's responses are working," she said. "If Sloane thought he was going to win cleanly in court, he wouldn't be burning hay barns." Silas hadn't thought of it exactly that way. He looked at her. "You're right," he said. "He's trying to wear you down financially so you settle before the court rules," she said. "Legal costs, livestock loss, and now the hay. He's adding up the pressure." She paused. "What does the hay shortage cost you in grain?" he told her. She absorbed the number with the specific expression of someone who already has their own financial problem and is now calculating how it intersects with this one. "I have something," she said. She said it carefully, in the tone of someone who has decided to say a thing and is going to say it all the way. "Evelyn, let me finish." She looked at him directly. "When my husband died, his mother gave me something. She said it was for emergency. A piece of jewelry. Her mother's brooch. I've been carrying it for 2 years because I couldn't bring myself to sell it." She paused. "It's worth enough to cover the grain and part of the legal costs." The kitchen was quiet. "That's not something you sell for a hay shortage on someone else's ranch," he said. "I thought about that," she said, "and I decided it's not someone else's ranch anymore." She held his gaze. "Is it?" He sat with that. He could feel the truth of it, had been feeling it for weeks. And he could also feel, with equal clarity, the weight of what she was offering, not the money. The statement the money represented, the line she was drawing between what this place had been in October and what it was now. "No," he said, "it isn't." She nodded. "Then let me help." He looked at the table. I was not a man who took help easily. He had built 8 years of not needing it into something that had the shape of strength, but was probably, he could see now, closer to a wall. Evelyn had understood this from the first week, he suspected. She'd never pushed at it directly. She'd just waited, the way she waited for most things, patient and alert and entirely clear about what she thought without demanding he arrive there on her schedule. "We'll call it a loan," he said. She almost smiled. "We'll call it whatever you need to call it," she said. The fire had one consequence that Silas hadn't anticipated. The neighbors knew by morning. In a valley where people were spread wide and news traveled through supply runs and post days and the informal network of anyone who'd passed another ranch's gate, a hay barn fire was visible for miles, and its meaning was legible to anyone who understood ranching. By the next afternoon, Tom Reeves had ridden over, not to ask questions, but to drop off 2 bales of hay from his own store with the matter-of-fact generosity of a man who knew the difference between charity and neighboring. "I've got more than I need," Tom said, which was probably true, but was also the polite version of something more deliberate. "I appreciate it," Silas said. Tom looked at the burned east wall. He looked at the origin point of the fire with the same reading eyes that Noah had used, and he didn't say anything, but his expression said it for him. "Word's around about the court filing too," Tom said after a moment. "Is it?" Silas said. Sloane's made enemies, Tom said. You're not the first. People remember. He paused. If there's anything the Valley can do, legally, I mean, people would want to know. Silas looked at him. He had a complicated relationship with asking for help, which Tom knew and was choosing not to address directly, which was why they'd been friends for 15 years. I'll keep that in mind, Silas said. See that you do, Tom said, and rode back home. The hay arrived from 2 other neighbors over the following 3 days, quietly and without ceremony. Not enough to replace what was lost, but enough to close the gap without the grain expense. Nobody made a speech about it. Nobody required thanks beyond the nod of acknowledgement that passed between men who understood that the valley's health was collective, that a ranch that failed in winter was a problem everyone felt in spring. Evelyn watched this happen with an expression that was careful and moved in equal parts. Is it always like this here? She asked him one evening, after the 3rd neighbor had come and gone. Like what? He said. People just showing up, she said, without being asked. He thought about it. When it's real trouble, he said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Where I was before, people waited to be asked, she said. And even then, sometimes not. That's a harder way to live, he said. It is, she said. She didn't say anything else about it, but he noticed her watching the road more after that, and the way someone watches a road when they've started to feel that what comes down it might be something good rather than something to brace against. Christmas came. Silas had not made much of Christmas in recent years. It was a day he'd been in the habit of treating like any other, doing the necessary work and spending the rest of it in the particular silence of someone who has organized themselves not to expect anything. He told himself this was practical. He told himself he didn't miss it. He'd been wrong about that, it turned out. Evelyn and Lily had been working on something in the kitchen for 3 days before Christmas with the conspiratorial focus of people who don't want to be asked what they're doing, and on Christmas morning there were things on the table that hadn't been there before. Small, careful things, made from what was available rather than from any store, which meant they had a handmade quality that was more personal than anything bought would have been. Lily had made Silas a small drawing, framed in a piece of cardboard she'd covered in cut paper, of Duchess the mare. It was not a technically accomplished drawing. Duchess had proportional issues and her legs were at angles that actual horses did not usually manage. But the expression on the drawn horse's face, the particular lifted chin quality that the real Duchess had when she was annoyed with something, which was exactly right. He looked at the drawing for a long time. She looks like herself, he said. Lily beamed. I practiced 12 times, she said. The legs were the hardest part. The legs are hard, he agreed. Noah had made him something too. A leather cord for the watch he carried, replacing the broken one that Silas had been meaning to fix for months and hadn't. The boy had done it neatly, with the careful stitching of someone who had paid attention when Silas showed him tack repair, and it fit the watch properly. Silas looked at it. He looked at Noah. Good work, he said. Noah nodded. He was trying not to look pleased with himself and not entirely succeeding. Evelyn gave him nothing in a package, but on Christmas morning she had made the kind of breakfast that required real effort and real care. The kind that said, without saying it, that she understood what days like this meant and had decided to meet them with intention rather than just letting them pass. She made it seem like it was just a meal. It was not just a meal. He sat at that table on Christmas morning with 3 people who had come into his house in October with a trunk and a plan, and had become, in the way that proximity and hardship and daily meals and real trouble could make people become, something he didn't have a clean word for yet. Family was a word. It was the right word. He wasn't ready to say it out loud, but he thought it. After breakfast, when Noah and Lily were occupied in the sitting room and the kitchen was quiet, Evelyn was washing dishes and Silas was sitting at the table with his coffee, and he said without building up to it, My father used to say Christmas was when you found out what your winter was actually made of. Evelyn looked back at him from the sink. What did he mean? He meant that by December, you knew what you'd gotten right and what you'd gotten wrong, Silas said. You couldn't pretend anymore, one way or the other. Winter made it plain. She was quiet for a moment, her hand still in the water. And what's your winter made of this year? He looked at his coffee cup. He looked at the room. He said, More than I started with. She turned back to the dishes. but he saw the small, real smile before she did. The last week of December brought two things that arrived within days of each other and changed the shape of everything that came after. The first was a letter from Edmund Garfield in Laramie. He'd done the title research on the original 1868 survey and found not only that the boundary description was accurate, but that Sloane's filing contained a material misrepresentation of the original document, a deliberate alteration in the copy he'd submitted to the court that didn't match the original on file at the Territory Land Office. It wasn't just a weak legal challenge. It was fraud. This changes the case significantly, Garfield had written. I am preparing a motion to the court that, if accepted, will not only dismiss Sloane's challenge but expose him to sanction. I need you in Laramie by the second week of January to review and sign the supporting affidavit. Silas read the letter twice. Then he set it on the table and called Evelyn in from the sitting room. She read it. He watched her face as she read. When she was done, she looked up. Her expression was steady and careful, the way it was when she was thinking rather than reacting. He falsified the document, she said. Yes. Which means every case he's run this way may be vulnerable to the same argument, Silas said. If someone looks. She set the letter down. We need to tell Tom Reeves, she said. I know, he said. And the other families he's pushed around, she said. If Garfield can document the pattern, one thing at a time, he said. The affidavit first. Then we see what Garfield thinks about the broader exposure. She nodded. But he could see her thinking ahead, not recklessly, not with revenge as the motive, but with the practical intelligence of someone who understood that if you had a tool, you used it fully. And if Sloane had been running fraud across the valley for 6 years, the remedy was proportional to the harm. The second thing came on the last day of December. He came in from the evening check of the livestock to find Evelyn at the kitchen table with her small notebook open, but she wasn't doing figures. She was sitting with her hands flat on the table on either side of the notebook, looking at something inside it, and there was a stillness about her that was different from her usual stillness. Not calm, but very controlled. He sat down. She looked up. In her face there was something he hadn't seen there before, not fear exactly, but the near relative of it. The kind of expression a person had when something had touched a place they'd worked hard to keep protected. The Cheyenne case, she said. I got a letter today. He waited. The other party has appealed the ruling, she said. The one we won. 14 months of fighting and we won. And now they're appealing and the lawyer says it could run another year. She paused. I don't have another year's worth of money. He sat with that for a moment. He thought about what she'd told him in November, that they'd won, but there'd been nothing left to win, that she'd been handling it alone, that she'd come to Garnet Creek because the math had told her this was the right option. I thought about the brooch that had belonged to her husband's mother, sold or about to be sold because a hay barn had burned on a cold December night. He thought about Victor Sloane and Edmund Garfield, and the falsified document, and the motion that was going to the court in January. He looked at Evelyn across the table. She was looking back at him with the expression of a person who is not going to ask for more than they've already asked for, who has drawn a line at her own dignity and is holding it even when holding it is hard. He said, Tell me exactly what the appeal involves. She told him. He listened to all of it. When she was done, he said, Garfield handles land cases. He may know someone in Cheyenne who handles estate challenges. She looked at him. Silas, you fought your case alone for 2 years, he said. You don't have to fight it alone from here. She was quiet. He could see something in her working, the part of her that had learned through 2 years of being alone with a problem, to handle things herself, to not let herself lean on what might not hold. It was the same part of himself he'd been watching slowly shift since October. It didn't go easily in either of them. You didn't dismantle 2 years of careful self-sufficiency in an afternoon. I'm not comfortable with that, she said. I know, he said. Do it anyway. She looked at him for a long time. Why? She said. It was a fair question. She meant, why does this matter to you enough to offer it? She meant, what are we to each other that justifies this? She wasn't being difficult. She was being honest, which was what she always was, and she deserved the same in return. He said, because whatever we're doing here, whatever this is, it's not nothing, and I'm not going to treat it like nothing when you need help. She held his gaze. He held hers. Okay, she said. Quiet. Final. He nodded. Outside, the last night of December was cold and clear and absolutely still. The kind of stillness that only happened in deep winter, when the wind took a breath and everything went quiet at once. And you could hear, if the house was quiet too, the particular sound of the cold itself. Not a sound exactly, but the absence of every other sound, the world held in place by its own temperature. They sat in that kitchen for a while longer, both of them at the table, the coffee cooling between them, without talking. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had said the important things, and were sitting with them, letting them settle into the room the way things settled when they were true. January was coming. It would bring Laramie and Garfield and the affidavit and whatever Sloan did when he understood that his fraud was about to be placed in front of a judge. It would bring decisions that neither of them had made yet, but that were closer than they'd been on any other night. Silas looked at the dark window. He thought about the ridgeline he couldn't see and the north pasture he couldn't see and the water source at the top of it that Sloan had been trying to take, and that was now the center of a fight that had become more than just his. He thought, I am not afraid of what's coming. He checked that thought for honesty. He thought, I'm afraid of some of it, but not the way I used to be afraid of things. Not the kind of fear that made you back away. The kind that meant something was worth protecting. That was a different thing entirely. The new year came in without ceremony. Silas was up at 4:30, the same as every morning, and the first thing he did was check the temperature by the feel of the air when he opened the back door. Cold enough to see his breath inside the doorframe, which meant well below 20 outside. He dressed, started the stove, and had the coffee going before anyone else was moving upstairs. This was the part of the day that still belonged entirely to him, these first 40 minutes of dark and quiet, before the house came alive, and he'd come to understand over the past 3 months that he no longer needed that solitude the way he'd needed it in October. He still valued it. It was just different now. Less like a man guarding the last quiet place in his life, and more like a man taking a breath before a day he was actually willing to walk into. He thought about Laramie. He'd be riding out the day after tomorrow for the affidavit signing with Garfield, and he'd thought carefully about what that meant beyond the legal dimension. Garfield's motion exposed Sloan's fraud directly. If the court accepted the motion, and Garfield believed it would, the consequences for Sloan would extend well past the water rights challenge. Fraud in a territorial court filing was not a minor thing. It had teeth, real ones. What Silas was less sure about was what Sloan would do between now and when that motion landed. A man who had been operating the way Sloan operated for 6 years did not simply wait for a court to rule against him. He had resources, and he had men, and he had the particular ruthlessness of someone who had decided long ago that rules were navigational tools rather than actual limits. The hay barn fire had been a message. If Sloan found out about Garfield's motion before it was filed, and in a territory where information traveled along the same routes as everything else, there was a real chance he'd send a louder one. Silas was thinking through this when Evelyn came downstairs. She poured her tea without asking if coffee was ready, which was her habit, and she sat down across from him, and they sat in the early morning the way they'd come to sit in it, not performing companionship, just occupying the same space with the ease of two people who had stopped calculating how much space they were allowed to take up. You're thinking about Sloan, she said. Yes, he said. What specifically? What he does when he finds out the motion is coming, Silas said. He'll find out. These things don't stay quiet. Evelyn wrapped both hands around her mug. He's already shown his hand, she said. He burns things and pulls fence posts. If he escalates past that, he has men who used to be lawmen, Silas said. They know how to make things difficult without crossing obvious lines. She was quiet for a moment. What do you need to do before you ride to Laramie? Make sure everything here is solid, he said. The livestock secured, the water lines checked, the hay covered better than it is. If something happens while I'm gone, Noah and I can manage 2 days, she said. I know you can, he said. That's not what worries me. She looked at him directly. Then say what worries you. He said it. I don't want you here without backup if Sloan decides to send someone. She held his gaze. There was no alarm in her face. She'd been through 2 years of legal intimidation in Cheyenne, and she was not a woman who frightened easily. But she took what he'd said seriously, which was what he needed. "Who do you trust in the valley?" she said. "Tom Reeves," he said immediately. "The Halverson brothers 2 miles east. Pete Garland knows everything that moves through Garnet Creek." "Talk to them before you go," she said. He nodded. He'd already been planning to, but she'd said it the way she said most things, not as a suggestion, as a conclusion they'd reached together, which was different. He rode to Tom Reeves that afternoon and said what needed to be said plainly. He was going to Laramie. Sloan was likely to know why within the week, and could Tom keep an eye on the Mercer place while he was gone? Tom said yes before Silas finished the sentence. He said it the way a man said yes to something he'd been waiting to be asked. "The Halverson boys too," Tom said. "I'll tell them. We'll work a rotation." "I don't need a rotation." "No, but Evelyn might," Tom said. Not unkindly, just direct. "She's sensible and she's capable, and she's also a woman alone with 2 children on a ranch that a dangerous man has already burned once. A rotation is right." Silas looked at him. "All right," he said. He stopped at Pete Garland's on the way back and told Pete to watch for anything unusual. Anyone asking questions about the Mercer place. Anyone coming through town who didn't have business there. Pete said he always watched for unusual, which was true, and that he'd send word if anything moved. When Silas got home that evening, Noah was in the barn finishing the evening chores, and Silas worked alongside him without explanation for a few minutes before he said, "I'm riding to Laramie day after tomorrow, 2 nights. Noah kept working. "I know," he said. "Mom told me." "While I'm gone, I'll check the water lines morning and evening," Noah said. "I'll make sure the livestock are secured at night. I'll keep the house locked after dark." He paused. "I know what needs doing." Silas looked at him. The boy was 12 years old and 5 feet 4 inches and had been on this ranch for 3 months and was giving him a damage control checklist with the calm efficiency of a man twice his age. "I know you do," Silas said. "Mr. Mercer," Noah said, and stopped. It was the first time he'd used the formal address in weeks. Silas turned to look at him fully. Noah was looking at the ground for a moment, and then he looked up, and in his face was the particular expression of a 12-year-old boy who has something important to say and is trying to find the right form for it. "We're not going to let him take this," Noah said, "whatever he tries. I want you to know that." Silas stood in the barn in the cold with this boy who had his father's stubbornness and his mother's honesty, who had spent 3 months learning a ranch he'd never been asked to care about as though it was already his. And he felt something happen in his chest that he didn't have a clean name for. "I know," he said. He put his hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. Not a complicated gesture, just a touch, the kind that said more than most words. And then he went to put up his own horse, and Noah went back to his work, and neither of them said anything else about it. He left for Laramie on the morning of January 3rd, in cold that had teeth in it, and he rode the whole 2-day trip with the particular focus of a man who has left something valuable behind him and needs to get back to it. Garfield met him with the affidavit ready. 30 pages of documented evidence, the falsified copy side by side with the original from the Territory Land Office, the discrepancy annotated in Garfield's precise legal hand. Silas read it twice and signed where he was told to sign. "When does it go to the court?" Silas asked. "Monday," Garfield said. "I want to file in person, not by post. I'll ride to the courthouse myself." He paused. "You should know. I've been looking at Sloan's other filings. There are 3 other property challenges in the past 4 years that show the same pattern, same type of discrepancy in the survey copies." "Same fraud," Silas said. "In my opinion, yes. The judge will have to make that determination, but if he does," Garfield set down his pen, "Sloan loses everything he's built through those filings. The challenged properties revert. The families he displaced may have grounds for recovery." Silas thought about the valley, about Tom Reeves and the Halverson brothers, and the 3 families he knew Sloan had pushed off their land in the past 6 years, about a woman named Evelyn who had told him that if people watched out for each other here, it was different from where she'd come from. "Make the argument broad," Silas said. "Don't limit it to my case." Garfield looked at him. "That makes the filing more complex." "I know," Silas said. "Do it anyway." I was back at the ranch by the evening of January 5th, cold and tired, and he admitted this to himself on the last mile of the ride, in the dark, with the ranch lights visible ahead, glad to see the lights. Genuinely glad, the uncomplicated kind, the kind that didn't need examination. Noah had the barn door open when he rode in, which meant the boy had heard the hoofbeats and come out. He took the horse without being asked, and Silas went to the house. And when he came through the back door, Evelyn was at the stove and Lily was at the table with her notebook. And Montgomery the cat was on the kitchen chair he'd claimed as his own sometime in November. And it was so entirely and completely what he'd been riding toward that he stood in the doorway for a moment, just taking it in. Evelyn looked at him over her shoulder. "Affidavit signed?" "Signed," he said. "Filed Monday." She turned back to the stove. "Sit down. You look like you've been cold for 2 days." "I have been cold for 2 days," he said. He sat. Lily looked up from her notebook. "Montgomery caught a mouse while you were gone," she said. "I thought you should know he's contributing." "I appreciate the update," Silas said. He ate dinner and said very little, which was not unusual, but this particular quiet was a different kind than his old quiet. Not the quiet of a man managing distance, but of someone full of things that needed a few hours to settle before he could speak them. Evelyn seemed to understand this. She didn't push. She cleared the dishes and sent Lily to bed, and Noah followed without being told, which was its own evidence of how much the boy had grown in 3 months. And then it was just the two of them in the kitchen with the fire and the coffee. He told her everything Garfield had said. She listened to all of it, and when he got to the part about the other 3 families and the broader argument, she sat forward slightly with her hands around her mug and said, "He's been running this fraud across the whole valley." "For years," Silas said. "Maybe longer." She was quiet, processing. Then, "The families he displaced? Do you know them?" "2 of them," he said. "The Howards left 2 years ago, moved to Nebraska. The Castillo family. They're still in the territory, I think, over near Rock Springs." "If they can be found," she said, "they may want to know what Garfield found." "I thought the same thing," he said. "I'll talk to Tom." She nodded. She looked at her mug for a moment. Then she said, "While you were gone, one of Sloane's men came through the East Road." He went still. "Tom's man spotted him," she said quickly, reading his expression. "The rotation Tom set up. One of the Halverson brothers was on the east side of the property around midday on the 4th. Sloane's man didn't come onto the land. He stopped at the property line, sat there for about 10 minutes, and rode back." "A message," Silas said. "Yes," she said. "Tom thought so too. He came over himself that afternoon." She paused. "He stayed for dinner." "Tom stayed for dinner," Silas said. "Lily invited him?" Evelyn said. There was a very faint quality of amusement in her voice. "She said he looked hungry." Silas looked at the table. He thought about Tom Reeves at his dinner table, which had been empty of guests for 8 years, eating dinner with a 12-year-old who fixed fences and an 8-year-old who fed barn cats and a widow from Cheyenne who had turned his whole winter inside out. "Good," he said. She looked at him. There was something in her face that had been building for a while. He'd been seeing it in pieces, in the moments between conversations, in the particular quality of attention she gave him when she thought he wasn't watching. "Silas," she said. He looked at her. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Directly." "Go ahead," he said. She set down her mug. She looked at her hands for a moment, and then she looked at him with the full, unguarded honesty that he'd come to understand was her actual face, not the careful one she wore when she was managing something, but the one underneath it, the one that didn't perform. "What are we doing?" she said. "Not the practical version. I know the practical version. I mean, what is this? What are we actually doing here?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the January wind had picked up. He could hear it at the eaves of the house, that particular Wyoming winter sound that had always been, for him, the sound of being alone. It didn't sound like that tonight. "I think you know what we're doing," he said. "I want to hear you say it," she said. "Not because I need the words, because I need to know you're not managing something, that you're not being kind to me the way you're kind about everything, which is genuinely, but which isn't, it's not that," he said. "Then what is it?" He looked at her across the table and thought about October, about the yard and the gate, and a woman he hadn't expected who had stood 6 feet from him and asked the most direct question anyone had asked him in years. He thought about the month that followed, and the one after that, and every meal and fence line and sleepless morning and firelit evening in between. He thought about what it had felt like to ride back toward those lights tonight and know that they were his lights and her lights and the children's lights all at once, without any of those things canceling the others out. "I don't want to go back to what this was before," he said. "I can't. I don't want to imagine this place without you and the children in it. That's what it is." She looked at him for a long moment. "That took you a while," she said. And there was something in her voice, not cruel, not teasing, but fond in the specific way that came from knowing a person well enough to see their particular difficulty clearly. "I'm aware," he said. She almost smiled. "I don't want to go back either," she said. "I want you to know I haven't been sitting here waiting for you to figure it out. I've had my own figuring to do." "I know," he said. "I watched you do it." She looked at him. Something in her eyes was careful and open at the same time, which was still her combination, which he thought he would probably always find difficult to look at directly without feeling it. "So," she said. "So," he said. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said carefully, because this was not the kind of thing he was practiced at, and he knew it, "I'd like to make this permanent, if you're willing. The arrangement, and everything else it's turned into." She was quiet. He kept going, because he'd started and he didn't believe in stopping in the middle of things. "I'm asking you to marry me. Not because the winter requires it, and not because it solves a problem. Because I want you here. Because I want Noah and Lily here. Because this ranch stopped being mine alone somewhere around the second week of November, and I just took this long to say it out loud." The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze, which took more effort than facing a winter storm, and he didn't look away. "You're not doing this because you feel responsible for us," she said, making sure, being who she was. "No," he said, "and you're not doing this because you're afraid of what happens to us if you don't." "No," he said, "I'm doing this because I'd rather face whatever's coming, Sloan, the court, the next 10 winters, with you beside me than face any of it the way I've been facing everything, alone." She looked at him. "All right," she said, quiet and final and entirely, unmistakably, real. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "All right," he said. She looked at the table. Then she looked back up at him, and there was something on her face that was the truest expression he'd seen from her yet. Not performed, not managed, just there, visible, the way a person's face looked when they stopped guarding it. "I'll tell the children in the morning," she said. "I'll be there when you do," he said. She nodded. She picked up her mug. He picked up his coffee. They sat in the kitchen a while longer, not talking much, and it was the best kind of quiet he'd ever known in that room. The children took the news in ways that were entirely consistent with who they were. Lily, at breakfast the next morning, listened to Evelyn explain what had been decided, looked at Silas, looked at her mother, looked at Silas again, and said, "I knew." Noah looked at his sister. "You did not know." "I knew since November," Lily said, with the serenity of someone who has been patient about being right. "When he moved the chair in the sitting room so it faced the window better. Nobody moves a chair for someone they don't care about." Silas looked at the table. "That's a lot to read into a chair," Noah said. "The chair was just the beginning," Lily said. "There were many things after that." Noah looked at Silas. His expression was serious and careful, and 15 years older than 12. "Are you sure?" Noah said, to Silas, direct. Silas looked at him. "Yes," he said. "Because my mother doesn't need someone who's going to change his mind," Noah said. "She's had enough of things that didn't hold." "Noah," Evelyn said, quiet. "He's right to ask," Silas said. He held the boy's gaze. "I'm sure, and I don't change my mind about things that matter." Noah looked at him for a long moment with those eyes that took everything in and filed it carefully. Then he nodded, once, and went back to his breakfast. Lily said, "Can I tell Montgomery?" "The cat," Evelyn said, "cannot keep a secret." "He doesn't need to," Lily said. "I just want to tell him." The practical arrangements were made over the next 2 weeks, because practical arrangements were what Silas and Evelyn both understood. Neither of them inclined toward ceremony for its own sake, both of them more comfortable with the working version of things than the performed version. The judge who handled Garnet Creek's legal affairs came out to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon, and Tom Reeves and Pete Garland stood as witnesses, And the whole thing was done in 20 minutes in the sitting room with his mother's rocking chair in the corner and his father's books on the shelf and the barn cat on the windowsill, looking in with an expression of mild interest. It was not a large wedding. It was not a remembered wedding, in the sense of being talked about in town for years afterward. It was the right wedding, which was enough. Tom Reeves shook Silas's hand after and said, "Your father would have liked her." Silas thought about his father and the storage room and the coat on the hook and the box of documents that had turned out to hold the thing that saved the ranch. "Yes," he said. He would have. Edmund Garfield filed the broad motion on January 10th. By January 20th, word had reached Garnet Creek that the territorial court had accepted it for consideration and had issued a stay on all related Sloan filings pending review. This meant the water rights challenge was suspended, not dismissed yet, but stopped, which was its own kind of breathing room. It also meant Victor Sloan knew. The knowledge of what Sloan would do with this information sat at the edge of every day for the next week, the way a weather system sat at the edge of a ridgeline, visible, coming, not yet arrived. Silas kept the ranch's defenses as solid as they'd been since the hay fire, and Tom's rotation continued without discussion, and Pete Garland sent 2 notes about Sloan's men asking questions in town that Silas read and kept. What he hadn't anticipated was that Sloan would come himself. It was the last Saturday in January, a sharp, cold afternoon, and Silas was in the barn with Noah working on the tack that had been needing attention since before Christmas, when he heard horses on the road. Not one horse. Several. He came out of the barn into the gray afternoon light and saw Victor Sloan at his gate with 4 riders behind him, none of whom were men Silas had seen before, all of whom were built and positioned the way men were positioned when they were being paid to be noticed. Sloan himself was 50, broad, with the look of a man who had eaten well for a long time and expected to continue doing so. He was wearing a coat that was too expensive for the territory, and he had the particular expression of someone who had decided that what was about to happen was going to go his way regardless of the resistance. He stopped at the gate. He did not kick it open this time. "Mercer," he said. Silas stood in the yard. Noah was behind him, having come out of the barn without being asked, standing slightly to the left and back the way he'd learned to stand when he needed to be present without being in the way. "Sloan," Silas said. "Your lawyer's been busy," Sloan said. He said it with the tone of someone discussing something mildly inconvenient. "I thought we should talk like neighbors." "We're not neighbors," Silas said. Sloan smiled. "Every man in this valley is my neighbor," he said. "Some just don't know it yet." He looked past Silas at the house. "I hear you got married." "That's right," Silas said. "Fast," Sloan said. "Private," Silas said, which isn't the same thing. Sloan shifted in the saddle. His 4 riders hadn't moved. "Here's the thing, Mercer. Your lawyer found a clerical error. Happens in land office documents all the time. The court will look at it, make a correction, and the underlying challenge will still stand. You've bought yourself time, not a resolution." "Edmund Garfield doesn't make those kinds of arguments unless he's confident in them," Silas said. "Lawyers are always confident," Sloan said. "It's what they're paid for." He paused. "I'm offering you a resolution. Right now. Today, without going further. You sign a shared usage agreement on the water rights. I get access, you retain ownership, and we close the whole thing. The court challenge goes away, the legal costs stop adding up, and we all go back to our business." Silas looked at him. He understood with absolute clarity what Sloan was doing. A shared usage agreement wasn't a resolution. It was a foothold. Access granted in writing became the basis for the next challenge. The one that questioned whether exclusive ownership still made sense given shared usage. It was the same play Sloan had run 3 times before in different forms. The offer was designed to look like compromise and function like surrender. "No," Silas said. Sloan's expression didn't change. "Think it through," he said. "You've got a family now, a woman and 2 children. Winter isn't done. The kind of complications you've been seeing, fences down, livestock loose, barns catching fire, those are hard on a family." The yard was silent. Silas heard the back door of the house open. He didn't turn around. He knew who it was without looking. Evelyn came to stand beside him. Not behind him. Beside him. She'd taken a moment to put on her coat, which meant she'd watched from the kitchen window long enough to know this was going to require more than a minute. She stood in the cold January yard next to her husband and looked at Victor Sloan with the particular expression of a woman who had dealt with 2 years of legal intimidation in Cheyenne and had not buckled under any of it. Sloan looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not respect, but the recalculation of a man who has encountered a variable he hadn't fully accounted for. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. "Mr. Sloan," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at Silas. "Think about the offer," he said. "I've thought about it," Silas said. "No." Sloan gathered his reins. "You're going to regret making this hard," he said. Not loud, almost conversational. "I regret plenty of things," Silas said. "Defending my water rights won't be one of them." Sloan looked at him for one more long moment. Then he turned his horse and his 4 riders turned with him, and they rode back down the road toward the valley, and Silas watched them until they were out of sight. When they were gone, he became aware that he was holding himself very still in the way a man held himself when something had passed close enough to feel. He let his shoulders drop. He breathed. Evelyn said beside him, "He's going to escalate." "Yes," Silas said. "What does he have left to do?" she said. "He can go directly to the county judge and argue that Garfield's motion is retaliatory, that we're using the fraud allegation to deflect from the underlying challenge," Silas said. "It's thin, but it buys him more time and more cost." "He can also try the physical approach again," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Noah had come to stand on Silas's other side at some point in the last few minutes, and Lily was in the doorway of the house. Silas could see her from the corner of his eye, not stepping out, but watching, which was what she did when she was paying full attention to something. "Then we need more than Tom and the Halversons," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "The family's Sloan displaced," she said. "The Howards, the Castillos. Anyone else he's run this play on. If Garfield's motion covers their cases too, they have an interest in this fight. That's not just support, it's a coalition. And a man like Sloan, who operates on isolation, who picks off ranches one at a time because they're alone, he doesn't have an answer for a coalition." Silas looked at her. He thought about what she'd told him when she first proposed the arrangement back in October. "I'm not here to charm you, and I'm not here to make promises I can't keep." He thought about every version of competence and clarity and honest reckoning with difficult things that she'd shown him since then. He thought, "I have been, in my entire life, the most fortunate kind of wrong about what I needed." "Write down everything you know about the Castillos," he said. "I'll talk to Tom about the Howards. We'll have people in by the end of the week." She nodded. She looked at the road where Sloan had been. "He thinks having us here makes you vulnerable," she said. She was quoting herself from November, he realized, the conversation after he'd told her Sloan had come before she arrived. "I remember," he said. She looked at him. "Is he right?" He looked back at her, at his wife, standing in the January cold in the yard of a ranch that both of them now owned the particular way that people owned things they'd fought for, which was different from every other kind of ownership. "He's wrong," Silas said. "He's the most wrong he's ever been about anything." She held his gaze for a moment, then she nodded once and went back inside because there was work to do and she was not a woman who stood in cold yards longer than the moment required. Silas stood a moment longer. He looked at the road. He looked at the ridge line north of the property, bare and sharp against the January sky, with the water source at the top of it that a dishonest man had been trying for months to take away from him. He thought about what Garfield had said about the motion, about the families in Nebraska and Rock Springs, about the particular moment when a man who had been running a solitary operation long enough to think he was untouchable discovered that the people he'd underestimated had stopped being solitary. Noah was still standing beside him. The boy had not moved through any of it, not when Sloan's riders had shifted, not when the threat had been made, not when Evelyn had come out and stood beside his stepfather with the clear intention of remaining standing there. "You did right," Silas said. "Staying put." "I wasn't going to leave," Noah said. "I know," Silas said. "That's what I mean." They went inside together, out of the cold, into the house that smelled of coffee and the particular lived-in warmth of a place that had been brought back from disuse by people who cared about it. Lily was at the table. She looked up when they came in. "Is it over?" she said. "Not yet," Silas said. She nodded, accepting this with the calm of a child who had learned that honest answers were better than comfortable ones. "But it will be," she said. He looked at her. 8 years old, certain in the way that certain children were certain, not because they didn't understand the difficulty, but because they'd made a decision about the outcome that they had no intention of revisiting. "Yes," he said, "it will be." The letters went out on a Monday. Evelyn wrote them. She sat at the kitchen table on the Sunday evening after Sloane's visit with the lamp turned up, and her good pen, the one she kept in the inner pocket of her traveling bag, the one that had drafted 2 years of legal correspondence in Cheyenne, and she wrote to the Castillo family in Rock Springs, and to the address Tom Reeves had for the Howards in Nebraska, and to 2 other families Silas had remembered over the course of the week, names that had come back to him slowly. The way names came back when you started actually looking for them, rather than managing your way around the discomfort of knowing what had happened to their owners. She wrote clearly and without embellishment. She explained who she was, who her husband was, what Edmund Garfield had found in the Territorial Land Office documents, and what the broader motion meant for anyone who had lost land through Victor Sloane's filing process. She told them that if they had records, original deeds, survey maps, any correspondence from the period of their dispute, those records could matter now. She gave Garfield's address in Laramie. She gave her own. Silas watched her write without interrupting. When she was done, he read each letter once, and then he looked at her across the table and said, "You're good at this." "I had practice I didn't want," she said. She blotted the last letter and said it with the others. "Still," he said. She looked at him. There was something in her expression that was tired and clear in equal measure. The expression of someone who has been using a skill born from difficulty for long enough that they've made their peace with where it came from. "If these families have their records," she said, "and if Garfield can use them to build the pattern into the motion, Sloane doesn't just lose the water rights challenge. He loses the legal standing he's built everything on." "I know," Silas said. "And if he loses that—" She paused. "The properties he acquired through those filings become contestable. The families who left might be able to come back." Silas looked at the stack of letters. He thought about the Castillos, a husband and wife and 4 children, gone to Rock Springs with whatever they could carry because a water access dispute had been resolved against them by a court that hadn't known it was working from a falsified document. He thought about that family in Rock Springs right now, in January, making do. "One thing at a time," he said. "Get the motion through first." "I know," she said, "but it matters that we try." "It does," he said. She sealed the letters. He'd take them to town in the morning. The response from Garfield came before the responses from the families, which was expected. The families were at distance, and January post was slow. Garfield wrote on January 28th to say the court had scheduled a hearing on the motion for the 14th of February, that both parties would be required to present, and that Sloane's legal team had already filed a preliminary objection characterizing Garfield's motion as retaliatory, exactly as Silas had predicted. "He's following the script," Evelyn said, reading the letter at breakfast. "He doesn't have another one," Silas said. "Will the retaliatory argument hold?" Garfield says no. The discrepancy in the documents is objective. It doesn't matter why we found it. The court has to address it regardless of motive. She set the letter down. "February 14th, she said. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks was enough time for more things to happen than Silas would have liked, and some of them did. Sloane's men pulled another section of the east fence in the second week of January. Not damaging, just the usual message. The thumb pressed on the bruise to remind you it was there. Silas repaired it the next morning with Noah, who worked the fence posts with a wordless efficiency that had become, over 4 months, his particular mode of expressing feelings he didn't put into sentences. When they were done, Noah stood back and looked at the repaired section with his arms crossed and said, "He's going to keep doing this until the court rules." "Probably," Silas said. "So we just keep fixing it," Noah said. "Yes," Silas said. Noah looked at the fence for another moment. "That's what he's counting on," he said, "that it wears you down." "It won't," Silas said. Noah looked at him. "I know," he said. And then, with the precision that the boy always brought to the things he said directly, "I just wanted to say it out loud, so it was said." Silas looked at him. This child, this 12-year-old with his father's stubbornness and his mother's honesty and 3 months of Wyoming ranch work in his hands, had become something that Silas had not known, in October, that he was missing. Not a replacement for anything, something new. the specific shape of this particular boy in this particular life. It said, Silas told him. They went back to the house. The letter from the Castillo family arrived on January 19th. It was written in a careful, slightly formal hand that suggested someone who had thought hard about what to say and had chosen economy over length. They had their records. They had the original deed from before the dispute, and they had the survey copy that Sloane's lawyers had submitted to the court at the time, and they had kept both because, the letter said, my wife said we might need them someday, and she was right about most things. Silas read that line twice. He gave the letter to Evelyn. She read it and said, forward it to Garfield today. Already planning to, he said. The Howards wrote from Nebraska 4 days later. They did not have their original survey. It had been lost in the move, but they had copies of the court correspondence, including a letter from Sloane's lawyer that referenced the survey in terms specific enough for Garfield to work with. It wasn't the same as having the document, but it was something. It was a thread. When Silas forwarded both letters to Garfield with a note explaining what each family had, Garfield wrote back within the week, this is enough. I'm expanding the motion. The hearing on the 14th will address not only the Mercer water rights challenge, but the documented pattern of fraudulent survey submission in 3 separate territorial court cases. I will need Silas and Laramie by the 13th. He told Evelyn that evening. She said, I'm coming with you. He looked at her. Garfield should meet me, she said, and I want to be there. She paused. If this is our fight, I want to be there for it. He thought about Sloane's riders at the gate and Evelyn standing in the cold yard beside him without being asked. He thought about letters written at a kitchen table on a Sunday night to strangers who had lost their land. All right, he said. Tom can stay with the children. She nodded. Then she said, with a slight shift in her expression, the one that meant she was about to say something that had been sitting with her for a while. Noah's not going to like being left behind. No, Silas said. He won't. You should tell him yourself, she said. Not me. He did tell him the next morning in the barn before the day's work started. Noah listened to the whole thing, Laramie, the hearing, the expanded motion, Tom staying with the children. And when Silas was done, the boy was quiet for a moment in the careful way he was quiet when he was managing something. I want to go, Noah said. I know, Silas said. I've been part of this since the hay barn, Noah said. You have, Silas said. And what you did that day, and every day since, is part of why Garfield has a case to make. Your work here matters. It's not less important because it's not in a courthouse. Noah looked at the ground. Silas could see him working through it, the frustration and the reason behind the frustration, and the discipline to put it where it belonged. Will it be over after the hearing? Noah said. The legal part, most likely, Silas said. The rest of it, rebuilding what Sloane damaged, the families who might come back, that takes longer, but the immediate fight, yes. Noah looked up. Then I'll be here when you get back, he said, and you can tell me what happened. Every word, Silas said. Noah nodded. He picked up his work gloves. Tom Reeves snores, he said. I heard him last time he stayed for dinner and fell asleep in the chair. Lily thinks it's funny. I think it's loud. Silas kept his expression mostly straight. I'll be back in 2 days, he said. I know, Noah said, and went to his work. They rode to Laramie on the 13th, Silas and Evelyn, in cold that had eased slightly from January's worst, still hard, but the particular savagery of deep winter had softened by a few degrees, the way February sometimes offered, grudgingly, the first distant hint that it would not be winter forever. They rode side by side and talked some and were quiet some, and the quiet between them had the quality that good quiet had when you were with someone you didn't need to perform for. At one point, somewhere on the long flat stretch south of the ridge, Evelyn said, When this is over, the legal part, what do you want the spring to look like? He thought about it honestly. More cattle, he said. The North Pasture's been underused because of the water dispute. If we win the rights outright, we can expand the herd. Noah's going to want more responsibility. I'd like to give it to him formally, make it clear that what he does on this ranch matters. She was quiet for a moment. And the Castillos, she said, if their property becomes contestable and they want to come back, is there anything we can do? He looked at the road ahead. He'd been thinking about this too. Tom Reeves knows people at the Territorial Land Office, he said. If Garfield's motion opens up the contested properties, there may be a process. It won't be fast. But we could help, she said. We could help, he said. She nodded. She looked at the landscape, the wide, cold, unsparing landscape of Wyoming in February, which was not beautiful in any conventional sense, but had the kind of stark presence that got into a person if they were there long enough, that made the softer places feel insufficient by comparison. I didn't expect to want to stay, she said. It was quiet, almost to herself. In October, he said. In October I was doing the arithmetic, she said. Survival through spring, then reassess. That was the plan. She paused. I didn't plan past March. And now? She looked at him. Now I'm thinking about what we do in 5 years, she said. That's different. He looked at her. He thought about a woman standing 6 feet from a gate in October with 2 children and a trunk and a proposal built on practicality and honest need, who had turned out to be the most unpractical addition to his life he'd ever encountered, in the sense that she'd gotten into everything, every room, every habit, every long-defended wall. And he had not managed to find this alarming, which probably said something about him that he was still in the process of figuring out. It is different, he said. She smiled. Not the small, controlled one, the real one, which she gave less often and which meant more because of it. They rode into Laramie in the late afternoon and met Garfield that evening. It was exactly as Silas remembered, pipe smoke and old paper and 30 years of looking at land disputes. And he shook Evelyn's hand with the slight surprise of a man who had heard about her but was recalibrating based on the actual version. She asked him 3 questions about the motion in the first 5 minutes, all of them specific and technical, and by the third one, Garfield had stopped recalibrating and was just answering. After the meeting, walking back to the lodging house in the cold Laramie evening, Evelyn said, "He's good." "He is," Silas said. "He was surprised I knew what to ask," she said. "He got over it," Silas said. "People usually do," she said. Not bitterly, just accurately. The hearing on the 14th of February lasted 4 hours. Silas had been in territorial court twice before, once for a grazing boundary dispute that had been resolved in his favor, once as a witness in a neighbor's cattle theft case. He was comfortable with the formal mechanics of it, the particular rhythm of presentation and response, the way a judge listened. What he was less prepared for was the specific quality of attention in the courtroom when Garfield laid out the pattern. Not just the Mercer water rights challenge, but the 3 cases before it, the survey copies side by side with the originals, the documented discrepancy in each one. The room was not large. The judge was a compact man named Aldrich, who had been on the territorial bench for 11 years and had the expression of someone who had seen most varieties of legal bad behavior and could recognize a new variety without losing his composure. He looked at Garfield's evidence with the focused attention of a man who understood that what he was looking at was not a technical irregularity, but a deliberate pattern, and the quality of his looking changed as the presentation went on. Sloane's lawyer, a man from Cheyenne named Pratt, well-dressed, practiced, made the retaliatory argument as expected. He characterized Garfield's motion as an attempt to overwhelm a legitimate property challenge with unrelated allegations. He was articulate, and he was confident, and he was, in the final analysis, working with documents that didn't match their originals, and no amount of articulate confidence fixed that. Judge Aldrich asked Pratt 3 questions. The third one was, "Can you explain the specific discrepancy in the survey boundary notation in the 1874 Castillo filing?" Pratt said he would need time to research the underlying documents. Aldrich said he had the underlying documents. He held up Garfield's comparative exhibit. He asked the question again. Pratt said the discrepancy was likely a transcription error. Aldrich looked at him for a long moment, and then looked at the exhibit again, and then looked at the courtroom with the expression of a man who has arrived at a conclusion he would have preferred not to arrive at, but was not going to avoid. He did not rule from the bench. He said he would issue a written ruling within 10 days. But the 10 days were a formality. The quality of his attention during Garfield's presentation and the quality of his attention during Pratt's response told anyone who was watching which way the current was running. Silas and Evelyn rode back to Garnet Creek on the 15th. The written ruling arrived on the 22nd of February. Tom Reeves brought it out from the post office himself, which was not his job, but which he did anyway, riding up the track in the late morning with the envelope held up in one hand, the way a man held up something he wanted you to see from a distance. Silas took it from him. Evelyn stood beside him on the porch. Noah had come from the barn when he saw Tom's horse, and Lily was in the doorway. He opened it. He read it. Garfield's motion was granted in full. Victor Sloane's water rights challenge against the Mercer property was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. The court found material misrepresentation in the survey documents submitted in the Mercer case and in the 3 prior cases identified in Garfield's motion. All property rulings dependent on those submissions were vacated. The matter was referred to the Territorial Attorney General for further investigation into the conduct of the filing party. Referred to the Attorney General. That was the part with teeth. That was the part that meant Victor Sloane was no longer managing a civil dispute. He was managing a criminal investigation. Silas lowered the letter. Tom was watching him from the saddle. "Well?" Tom said. "We won," Silas said. Tom let out a breath that had clearly been held for a while. He got down from his horse. He shook Silas's hand with the grip of a man who meant it. Then he looked at Evelyn and said, with more feeling than his usual economy allowed, "Those letters you wrote, to the Castillos and the Howards, that was the thing that made it a pattern instead of a dispute." Evelyn looked at him. "They deserve to know," she said. "They did," Tom said, "and now something might actually get done about it." He looked at the letter in Silas's hand. The Attorney General's involvement means Sloane's operation gets looked at properly, not just these cases. "I know," Silas said. "Could mean the families come back," Tom said. "It could," Silas said. "It won't be fast." "No," Tom said, "but it won't be never, either." He looked at the property around him, the repaired fences and the hay barn with its rebuilt east wall, and the north pasture visible through the cold February air, solid and unchanged and still, after everything exactly where it was supposed to be. "Your father would have said something insufferable about perseverance right now," Tom said. Silas looked at him. "He would," he said. Noah said from the edge of the porch, "What does dismissed with prejudice mean?" "It means it's over," Silas said. "The challenge is done. He can't bring it again." Noah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good," in the particular flat tone he used when he'd been holding something tight for a long time and was only now putting it down. Lily said from the doorway, "Can I tell Montgomery?" Tom Reeves looked at Silas with an expression of complete bafflement. "The cat," Silas said. "Ah," Tom said. "He's been worried," Lily said with complete seriousness. "Tell him," Silas said. Lily went inside to find Montgomery, and Tom stayed for coffee, which became lunch, because that was what happened now. People came to the Mercer Ranch and stayed longer than they planned, not because they had nowhere to be, but because the place had the quality that good places had, the quality of being genuinely welcoming rather than merely functional. Silas noticed this from the outside, which was new, the ability to look at his own property and see what it had become. For 8 years he'd been too close to it, too inside the project of surviving it alone, to see it as anything other than the sum of its practical demands. Now he could see it the way a person saw something when they looked at it from beside someone else. The ranch that Tom Reeves rode to on a February morning with an envelope held up in his hand because he wanted to be there when they opened it. The ranch that had become, through the specific accumulation of 3 months and 1 hard winter, the kind of place where people wanted to be present for the important moments. He thought about that while Tom and Evelyn talked at the table and Noah went back to the barn and Lily conducted her announcement to the cat. He thought, this is what I was afraid of, not the loss of it, the having of it, the responsibility of a thing you could lose because it mattered. He'd built 8 years of walls around that fear and called them independence and called them practicality and called them the reasonable response of a man who had been hurt before. And all of it had been true. The hurt had been real. The walls had been a logical response. The solitude had been functional. He was not going to tell himself he'd been wrong to survive the way he survived. But survival was not the same as living. He understood that now the way you understood things that seemed obvious once you could see them and completely invisible before. You could get so good at protecting yourself from loss that you foreclosed the possibility of anything worth losing and call the resulting emptiness strength. And believe yourself mostly, and spend years in a house that was clean and cold and entirely without warmth, until a woman stood 6 feet from your gate and asked you whether you wanted a wife or just another winter alone. That question had not been about marriage. It had been about choice, about what a person decided to keep choosing when they had options they were too afraid to take. He had made the choice, finally, in the middle of his own life, with a woman who didn't flatter him, and two children who had named his horses and rearranged his bookshelves and told his barn cat the news of the day. And the result was a February afternoon with the ruling on the kitchen table, and Tom Reeves eating his wife's cooking, and Noah in the barn, and Lily somewhere inside delivering legal updates to a cat named Montgomery, and all of it was imperfect and demanding and fully, completely alive. He was grateful for all of it, including the hard parts. Maybe especially the hard parts, because the hard parts were what made it real. Victor Sloan left the territory by the end of March. He didn't announce it. He didn't make a statement or produce an explanation. His property in the valley went onto the market through a Cheyenne broker in the third week of March. And by early April, the house was empty, and the operation was wound down, and the men he'd hired had moved on to whatever came next for men like that. The Attorney General's investigation was still running. These things ran slowly, and the law's pace in a territory was not the same as its pace in an established state. But the investigation's existence was enough. Sloan was not a man who stayed where the ground had shifted under him. He found new ground. That was what men like him did. 3 of his former hired men came individually to Garnet Creek in March and April looking for work. 2 of them found it with ranchers who needed hands and didn't ask too many questions. The third one, the one who had stopped at the east property line and sat there for 10 minutes on the day Silas was in Laramie. That one Pete Garland told, quietly but without apology, that there wasn't much available in this particular valley. The man moved on. The Castillo family came back in April, not to their original property. That process was still working through the court, and it would take another year before it resolved. But to the valley, Rodrigo Castillo wrote first, in March, to say they were thinking about returning, and Evelyn wrote back to say there was work at the Mercer Ranch if they needed it while the property question was sorted. And they came in the second week of April with their 4 children and a wagon, and the particular look of people who have been somewhere that wasn't home and are not yet sure whether what they've come back to is still theirs. Silas met them at the gate. Evelyn stood beside him. Noah and Lily were behind them, Lily holding Montgomery with the confident grip of someone who has never been questioned about carrying a barn cat to important meetings. Rodrigo Castillo was a man about Silas's age, weathered in the way that men who worked the land were weathered, with a wife named Clara beside him, and 4 children ranged in ages from 6 to 16 looking at the valley, with the careful attention of children who had learned not to get too attached to places too quickly. He shook Silas's hand and said, "We didn't think anyone would fight for us." Silas said, "My wife wrote the letters." Rodrigo looked at Evelyn. She said, "You had the records. That was the thing that mattered." "My wife kept them," Rodrigo said. He glanced at Clara. "She said we might need them someday." Clara Castillo looked at Evelyn Brooks Mercer with the specific expression of one woman recognizing in another a particular quality of foresight that both of them had exercised in the absence of certainty. "I'm glad you kept them," Evelyn said. "So are we," Clara said. They stayed for dinner, all 6 of them. Tom Reeves happened to come by in the late afternoon and stayed too, because Tom Reeves had a way of being present at the Mercer Ranch on important days that had stopped requiring explanation. Lily organized the seating with the authority of someone who had been doing this her whole life. Noah talked to the oldest Castillo boy about ranch work with the seriousness of someone who had learned enough to teach. Silas sat at the head of his table, his family's table, and looked at the room full of people and thought about October. He thought about standing at a gate with his hand on the post, waiting for another practical arrangement to come to nothing, and being so certain he knew what was coming that he almost hadn't looked closely enough to see what was actually there. He had almost missed it. That was the truth of it. He had been so practiced at keeping people at the right distance that he had nearly practiced his way out of the one thing that had actually worked. He thought about what Lily had said, months ago, about the storage room door, that it felt like it had been waiting. He hadn't believed her at the time. She was 8, and she talked to barn cats, and the claim was not one that made rational sense. But he understood it now in a way he hadn't. Some things waited. Some people waited. Not with expectation, not with demand, but with the patient availability of something that knew its own value and was not going to reduce itself just because you weren't ready yet. Evelyn had waited. She'd been clear from the beginning about who she was and what she was doing and what she would not pretend. and she'd given him the time he needed to catch up to himself, and she'd done it without making him feel the cost of how long it took. That was its own kind of strength. He was still learning to name it properly. After dinner, when the Castillos had gone to the bunkhouse for the night, and Tom had ridden home and Noah and Lily were in bed, Silas and Evelyn sat on the porch in the April air, which was cold still but differently cold than January. The cold of a season ending rather than one entrenched, the cold that had a direction to it. She said, "What are you thinking?" He said, "I'm thinking about October." She looked at him. "What about it?" "How close I came to saying no," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "You almost did," she said. "I know," he said. "I felt it. I almost sent you away the way I sent everyone away." He looked at the dark yard, the barn, the north pasture he couldn't see but knew was there. "I don't know why I didn't." She said, "Because I didn't ask you to trust me. I asked you to make a practical decision. You could trust a practical decision without trusting anything else yet." He looked at her. "You gave me the version of the door I could actually open," he said. She almost smiled. "You needed the handle to be in the right place," she said. He looked at the ridgeline, dark against the April sky. "My father used to say that the things worth having were the things that asked something real from you," he said. "Not something easy. Something that cost." "What did he mean?" she said. "I think he meant that easy things don't change you," Silas said. "And being changed is the point. If you get through your life and nothing has changed you, nothing has gotten past the walls enough to actually move you, you haven't really lived it. You've just managed it." She was quiet. He could feel her listening the way she listened when something had landed. "Is that what you were doing?" she said. "Managing it?" "For 8 years," he said. "Yes." She looked at the yard. She looked at the barn with its rebuilt wall and the pasture gate and the lamp burning in the bunkhouse window where the Castillo family was sleeping for the first time back in the valley that had been taken from them. "I was doing the same thing," she said. "In Cheyenne. After my husband died. I told myself I was surviving, which was true. But surviving can become its own kind of trap if you're not careful. If you get good enough at it, you stop being able to imagine anything else." "What changed it?" he said. She looked at him. "I ran out of options that felt like surviving," she said, "and I had to choose something that felt like risking." He nodded. "You know what I think?" she said after a moment. "Tell me," he said. "I think most people know what they need," she said. "They just need someone to hold the door open long enough for them to stop being afraid of walking through it." She paused. "You held it open. You didn't even know you were doing it, but you did." He sat with that. Outside, the April night was settling into its own particular quiet. Not the brutal silence of January, not the held-breath stillness of deep winter, but the quiet of a season that was moving toward something. The grass in the north pasture would be coming in. The cattle would be moving out of winter patterns. Noah would want to talk about expanding the herd. Lily would want to plant something in the kitchen garden that Evelyn had been planning since February. Life was coming back in, the way it always did, with everything it required. He reached over and put his hand over hers where it rested on the porch rail. She turned her hand and held his. They sat like that for a while, in the April dark, on the porch of a ranch that had stopped being just his the same month it started being something worth having again. Years later. And there were years, good ones and difficult ones in the ratio that real years came without apology for the difficult. When young men who were new to the valley asked Silas Mercer how a man known across 4 counties as the most confirmed bachelor on the Wyoming frontier had ended up with a wife and 2 children and a house that people rode out of their way to visit, he would think about the question for a moment before he answered. He wouldn't say it was because Evelyn was extraordinary, though she was. He wouldn't say it was because the winter had forced the issue, though the winter had helped. He wouldn't say it was because he'd finally been ready, because he hadn't been ready. He'd been dragged into readiness by a woman who asked the right question at the right moment, and then had the patience to wait while he found his way to the answer. What he said, when he answered, was this: "She didn't try to convince me I was wrong about myself. She just showed up and stayed, and let the facts do the convincing." And Evelyn, if she was within earshot, would say, "He wasn't as hard to reach as he thought he was. He just needed someone who wasn't afraid of the distance." And Noah, who was by then tall and capable and running the North Pasture operation with the same careful competence he'd brought to everything since he was 12, would say nothing because he'd heard the story enough times to know where it ended, and he was quietly fond of the ending. And Lily, who had grown into a person with her mother's honesty and her own particular kind of clear-eyed perception, would say, "I knew in November, when he moved the chair." Nobody ever successfully argued with Lily about this. The ranch grew. The family grew in the way families grew. Not smoothly, not without friction, not without the particular difficulties that came from two adults who had both spent years being self-sufficient, trying to learn the ongoing negotiation of sharing a life without losing themselves in it. They argued sometimes. They misunderstood each other sometimes. Evelyn had a capacity for focused silence when she was angry that Silas found harder to navigate than direct confrontation, and Silas had a habit of going quiet when he needed to think that Evelyn had to learn not to read as withdrawal. These were not fatal flaws. They were the ordinary material of two people trying to build something together, which was hard in the specific way that worthwhile things were hard. Not because they were wrong, but because they required continuous effort, continuous choice, continuous decision to keep going toward each other rather than retreating to the easier solitude of being only yourself. They made that decision. Every day, imperfectly, they made it. The North Pasture water rights were documented and clear, registered formally with the Territorial Land Office in Garfield's name in March. Silas's name on every line. They were never challenged again. The Castillo family's property case resolved the following spring in their favor. Rodrigo and Clara came back to their original land with their children and started over with the particular determination of people who had been away from something they loved and knew now exactly what they'd had. The Attorney General's investigation into Victor Sloan concluded 2 years later with findings that were sent to a federal court in Cheyenne and that Silas read about in a letter from Garfield without particular satisfaction and without regret. Justice in a territory moved at its own pace and arrived in its own form, and what mattered was not the ending of Sloan's story, but the continuation of the valleys. The valley continued, and the winters came every year, as they had always come and would always come, hard and long and cold, in the particular Wyoming way that demanded everything from the people who chose to live through them. But the Mercer Ranch met every winter with a full house and a working table and two people who had chosen each other across a gate in October with no promises of easy and no guarantee of warmth, only the honest proposition that survival was better shared and that some winters were worth facing not because you had to, but because what you were protecting had become worth the cold. That was enough. That had always been enough. It just took some people longer than others to understand it, and the understanding, when it finally came, was not smaller for arriving late.